Welcome, night seekers, to Black Screen Horror. Tonight, you'll experience true, scary stories, whispered narration, and the calming sound of gentle rain. So dim the lights, close your eyes, and step into the darkness. If you enjoy tonight's journey, don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment. Now, relax, listen closely, and sweet dreams if you can. I was 12 years old the night my whole understanding of the world quietly broke apart, and I have never been able to put it back together the same way since. It happened in my parents' bedroom on an evening so ordinary that I can still remember the small, boring details of it better than I remember plenty of things that felt important at the time. That's the strange thing about the worst moments of your life. They rarely announce themselves. They slip in wearing the same clothes as any other Tuesday, and by the time you realize something is wrong, it's already too late to look away. We lived in a modest house on a quiet street, the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen. My dad worked long hours, so evenings when he was actually home and relaxed were something I looked forward to. I liked sitting in my parents' room while he unwound from the day, half doing my homework, half just talking to him about nothing in particular. School, friends, some show I'd watched, whatever crossed my mind. He would sit on the edge of the bed, still in his work clothes, and listen in that half-distracted way parents do, nodding along while doing something else with his hands, like sorting mail or checking his phone. That night was no different at first. The house was quiet, except for the low hum of the television in the living room, which nobody was really watching. My mom had gone into the closet to put away laundry, a chore she did most evenings after dinner. The closet in my parents' room was a walk-in, not huge, but big enough that you could stand inside it comfortably and see most of it from the doorway if the light was on. That night, though, the light was off. She hadn't bothered to turn it on. I guess because she only intended to be in there for a minute, hanging a few shirts and folding some towels on the shelf. The light spilling in from the bedroom was enough to see her by, a soft yellow wash that fell across the closet floor and up onto the shelves, leaving the back corners in shadow, but keeping the middle, where she stood, clearly lit enough to make out her shape. I want to be clear about this part because it matters. I could see her. Not perfectly, not like she was standing in bright daylight, but clearly enough to know it was her, the way you know your own mother's silhouette without needing to see her face. She had her hair up in the little bun she always wore when she was doing chores around the house, the same one she'd worn my whole life, twisted and pinned in that specific way that was so her that I could have picked her out of 100 silhouettes just from that alone. She was standing at the shelf, her arms moving in that unmistakable motion of someone folding a towel over and under, smoothing it flat, setting it down, reaching for the next one. It was the most unremarkable thing in the world. My mother, folding laundry, half hidden in the dark of a closet, while I sat on the floor of the bedroom telling my dad about something that had happened at school. At some point in the conversation, my dad remembered something he needed to ask her. I don't even remember what it was anymore. Something small and practical. The kind of question you toss over your shoulder without thinking twice, expecting an answer to come back just as easily. He said her name, raising his voice just enough to carry into the closet. Nothing, no answer, no pause in her folding, nothing to suggest she'd even heard him. He said it again, a little louder this time, the kind of tone that meant he assumed she was distracted or hadn't caught it the first time. Still, nothing. Not a word, not a glance in our direction, not even a change in the rhythm of her hands. She just kept folding, steady and calm, like the sound of his voice hadn't reached her at all. That's when the irritation crept into him. The particular irritation you get when you feel like you're being ignored by someone in your own house for no reason. He called her name a third time, and this time there was an edge to it. Sharper, more insistent, the tone parents use when patience is running out. And still, nothing. The shape in the closet didn't turn, didn't pause, didn't so much as tilt its head to acknowledge that a man had just raised his voice at her from 10 feet away in a quiet house where sound travels easily. She just kept folding, over and under, smoothing flat, setting down, reaching again. By the time he called her name a fourth time, he was genuinely angry. The kind of controlled anger that comes right before someone starts raising real accusations. The "are you seriously ignoring me" kind of anger. I remember feeling that familiar tightening in my stomach that kids get when their parents are about to argue. That instinct to make yourself smaller and quieter so you don't get pulled into the blast radius. I got up from where I was sitting on the floor, thinking maybe I should just go check on her myself, smooth things over, ask her directly what he wanted so this wouldn't turn into one of those pointless arguments about not listening. I took a few steps toward the closet doorway, and that's when I heard footsteps behind me, coming from the hallway. I heard my mother's voice before I even turned around, casual and a little confused, the voice of someone walking in on the tail end of an argument they don't understand. She asked my dad why he was yelling her name like that, what was so urgent that he needed to shout it 3 or 4 times. I spun around, and there she was, standing in the bedroom doorway behind us, a towel wrapped around her body, and another around her wet hair. The unmistakable evidence that she had just stepped out of the shower down the hall. Her hair was down, dripping slightly at the ends where it had escaped the towel. She looked at us both with a mildly annoyed, mildly amused expression of someone who'd been minding her own business in the bathroom, while apparently being shouted at from another room. For one full second, my brain simply could not process what I was looking at. Because if she was standing right there, freshly out of the shower, hair wet and loose, wrapped in a towel, then who, or what, was standing in the closet not 10 feet away from her, folding towels with its hair pinned up in that same familiar bun? I turned back toward the closet so fast I almost lost my balance. There was nothing there. I don't mean that the figure had moved, or ducked out of sight, or slipped behind the hanging clothes. I mean the closet was simply empty in the exact way an ordinary closet is empty when there is no one inside it. No shape shifting in the shadows, no silhouette retreating into a corner, no sense of something having just been there and quickly stepped out of view. It was just clothes on hangers, folded towels on the shelf, and darkness in the corners where the bedroom light didn't reach. Whatever had been standing there, moving its arms in that patient, familiar rhythm, was gone as though it had never existed in the first place. And there had been no time, no possible window, for it to have gone anywhere. The doorway was right beside me. I would have seen it pass. There was no other way out of that closet. I stood there frozen, staring into that empty space, waiting for some part of my brain to offer an explanation that made sense. A trick of shadow, a coat that resembled a person, anything. Nothing came. I turned to look at my dad, and the look on his face told me everything I needed to know before either of us said a word. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring past me into that same empty closet, his jaw slightly slack, his angry expression from a moment ago completely wiped away and replaced with something closer to fear, an expression I had genuinely never seen on him before and have rarely seen since. Adults are not supposed to look like that. It unsettles you in a way that's hard to explain unless you've seen it. Watching someone who is supposed to be your source of safety and certainty suddenly look every bit as frightened and lost as you feel. My mom, still standing in the doorway with her towel and her wet hair, asked what was wrong, why we were both staring into the closet like that, why nobody had answered her question. Neither of us said anything for a moment. What could we say? That we had both just watched something wearing her exact shape, down to the specific way she wore her hair, standing calmly in the dark folding laundry, ignoring a man calling its name over and over, only to vanish completely in the single second it took me to turn around? Eventually, my dad said something vague, some excuse about thinking he heard something, and my mom, sensing something was off but not pushing it, just shrugged it off and went to get dressed. But the moment she turned away, my dad looked at me, and I looked at him, and neither of us needed to say a word to know that we had just experienced the exact same thing at the exact same time. That's the part that has stayed with me all these years. The part that stops me from being able to explain it away as a trick of the light, or a shadow that looked like a person if I squinted at it, or my imagination running away from me the way kids' imaginations sometimes do in the dark. My dad was not an imaginative man. He was not someone who believed in ghosts or spirits or anything of the sort, and if I had been the only one to see it, I would have eventually convinced myself I'd made it up, that the shape had just been a bundle of clothes, that the movement had just been shadows shifting as headlights passed outside. But he saw it too, at the same time, from a different angle, and it matched exactly what I saw. The bun, the stillness in the face we couldn't quite make out, the unbothered rhythm of the folding, undisturbed by a man's raised, angry voice calling out a name that, apparently, wasn't meant for whatever was standing in that closet at all. We never talked about it in detail after that night. Not really. It was one of those things that got mentioned in passing over the years. Usually late at night, usually in a hushed voice, as if speaking about it too loudly might summon it back. My dad would occasionally bring it up when the conversation drifted toward ghost stories, always ending with the same line, that whatever it wasn't her. And it definitely wasn't nothing either. Because two people don't imagine the exact same impossible thing at the exact same moment from two different points in a room. I've turned that night over so many times in my head since, trying to find some rational explanation that fits all the details, and I can never quite make it work. It wasn't a trick of light, because the shape moved with purpose, folding towels in a way no shadow can imitate. It wasn't a stranger who slipped in and out, because there was nowhere for a person to go in those few seconds, and my mother would have noticed someone else in the house wearing her clothes and mimicking her habits. It wasn't my imagination, because my father, a man with no patience for ghost stories and no history of seeing things, watched the exact same impossible figure at the exact same time, reacted to it in the exact same visceral way, and never once tried to explain it away as anything other than what it was. Something wearing my mother's shape that was not my mother at all. To this day, I don't like being in a room with a dark closet if I'm not the only one in it. I don't like glancing toward shadowed corners out of the edge of my vision, because some small, stubborn part of my brain is always half expecting to see a familiar shape standing there, quietly going about some ordinary task, waiting for someone to say a name it has no business answering to. Most people, when they hear this story, ask the same question, wondering what it was, what it wanted, why it chose that night, that room, that shape. I never have an answer for them because I don't have one for myself either. All I know is that something stood in my parents' closet that night, wearing my mother's exact form, down to the way she wore her hair, and it stayed calm and steady even while being yelled at by name, and the instant real proof of my mother appeared elsewhere in the house. Whatever that thing was disappeared as if it had simply stopped existing. I've had strange moments before and since, flickers of unease that most people chalk up to imagination or tiredness or an overactive mind playing tricks in the dark. But this is the one that never loosens its grip on me. because it isn't just mine to doubt. My father carries it too, exactly as I do, and neither of us has ever been able to shake the memory of turning toward an empty closet and finding absolutely nothing, where, only a second before, something had been standing so still and so familiar that we hadn't even thought to question it. Right up until the real woman it was imitating walked through the door behind us. My father died in the year 2005, and at the time my daughter was barely a year old, still small enough that she didn't understand what had happened, still too young to know that the man who used to hold her had suddenly stopped coming around. His death left a gap in our family that none of us really knew how to fill, and in the months that followed, we made the decision that probably felt practical at the time, but that none of us fully understood the weight of until much later. My husband at the time, my sister, my baby daughter, and myself packed up what we had and moved on to the farmland my father had owned before he passed, land that had been in the family for years, land that still held every trace of him in the soil, the fences, the old house standing in the middle of it all, like it was waiting for someone to come back. I want to say that moving on to that land felt like coming home, and in some ways, it did. There was comfort in being surrounded by the place my father had built with his own hands, in walking through rooms he had walked through 1,000 times, in falling asleep under a roof he had put up himself. But there was also something else there with us from almost the very beginning, something none of us wanted to admit out loud for a long time, something that revealed itself slowly, in small, strange moments that we each tried to explain away on our own before we ever spoke about it to each other. It started with my husband, not dramatically, not with anything that seemed important enough to take seriously at first, just small disturbances in the middle of the night that felt more like an inconvenience than anything sinister. A few times a week, always around the same dead hour of the night, he would shake me awake, his voice tight and urgent in that particular way people sound when they've just woken from something unsettling. He would tell me, every time, the exact same thing. A male voice is in your sister's room. That was it. No elaboration, no explanation, just that one sentence, delivered with a kind of certainty that should have alarmed me more than it did. I was always half asleep when this happened, dragged up out of deep sleep into a groggy, disoriented haze where nothing feels quite real yet. And in that state, my response was almost automatic. I would mumble back to him, barely coherent, something like, "It's the old man, don't worry about it." And then I would drift right back under before I even had the chance to process what I just said. Looking back now, that response terrifies me almost as much as the events themselves, because I wasn't just brushing him off as him imagining things. Some part of me, some sleepy, half-conscious part of my brain, genuinely believed there was a male voice in that room, and genuinely believed it belonged to my father, and was completely unbothered by that belief. I would even hear it myself sometimes, in that same half-awake state, a low murmur of a voice that I recognized instinctively as my dad's, though I could never make out actual words, just the tone and cadence of him, familiar enough that my sleeping brain filed it under safe rather than alarming. This happened over and over for a couple of months. My husband would wake me, tell me the same thing, and I would give him the same sleepy, unconcerned answer, and we would both fall back asleep without ever really discussing it in the light of day. It became almost normal, in the strange way that unsettling things can become normal if they happen often enough without anything dramatic occurring alongside them. We didn't talk about it over breakfast. We didn't bring it up to my sister. It just existed as this quiet, recurring disturbance in the middle of our nights that neither of us wanted to examine too closely. Maybe because some part of both of us already suspected that Examining it too closely would mean admitting something we weren't ready to admit. Then came the day in the kitchen, and that day changed everything, because it was the first time the presence made itself known to me while I was fully, completely awake, in the middle of an ordinary task, with no confusion or grogginess to soften the impact of what I heard. I was standing at the counter making a potato salad, the kind of mundane domestic task that fills up an afternoon without requiring much thought, chopping and mixing and half listening to whatever noise was happening elsewhere in the house. My back was to the kitchen doorway, and then, clear as anything, clear as if someone were standing directly behind me, close enough to feel their breath, I heard my father's voice say my name, followed by a sentence that turned my blood to ice the second I processed it. He said, "To Niall, something is wrong with your sister," using her name, speaking with an urgency that cut straight through the calm of that ordinary afternoon. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't a half-asleep haze. This wasn't grogginess playing tricks on a barely conscious mind. I was standing there, fully alert, knife in hand, humming to myself over a bowl of potatoes, and my dead father's voice spoke directly into the back of my neck, with a clarity and specificity that no trick of imagination could have produced. I let out a scream that came from somewhere deep and involuntary, a sound I didn't consciously choose to make, the kind of scream that rips out of you before your mind has even caught up to what your body already understands. I spun around, dropping the knife, my heart slamming against my ribs, and there was nothing there. Just the empty kitchen doorway, the hum of the refrigerator, the ordinary afternoon light coming through the window, completely undisturbed, as if nothing at all had happened. I stood there shaking for a long time after that, staring at the empty space behind me, trying to convince myself that stress or exhaustion or grief had finally caught up with me and manufactured something that wasn't real. Losing a parent does strange things to the mind, and I told myself that was all this was, some manifestation of unresolved grief finally surfacing in a moment of quiet domesticity. I didn't tell anyone what had happened that day, not right away. I think some part of me was embarrassed, and another part of me was simply too frightened to say it out loud, because saying it out loud would mean admitting that I believed it, and believing it meant admitting that something impossible had just happened in my own kitchen. I let it sit for a day, maybe two, telling myself I was imagining things, telling myself grief plays tricks on the mind, telling myself that all of us, my husband included, were probably just losing our minds a little in that big old house full of my father's memory. But things didn't stop. If anything, they got stranger, and they got harder to explain away with each passing day. The reflection came next, and this is the part of the story that still makes the hair on my arms stand up whenever I think about it in any real detail. There's a long mirror in the hallway just outside what used to be my father's room, the same room my sister had been staying in since we moved onto the property. More than once, moving through that hallway on some ordinary errand, laundry in my arms, or heading toward the kitchen, I caught movement in that mirror that made me stop dead in my tracks. A reflection of my father, unmistakably him, his shape and his stance and the particular way he used to hold himself, stepping out of that bedroom doorway in the mirror's reflection, only for there to be absolutely nothing there when I turned to look at the actual doorway itself. It happened more than once. It wasn't a single, easily dismissed glimpse. It was a pattern, a repeated occurrence that I could not talk myself out of, no matter how badly I wanted to. Each time it happened, I would freeze completely, waiting to see if it would happen again, waiting to feel some kind of danger or malice radiating from whatever was showing itself to me. And every single time, that feeling never came. If anything, the overwhelming sense I got standing in that hallway, staring at an empty doorway that had just held my father's reflected shape moments before, was one of restlessness rather than threat. It felt less like something haunting us, and more like something that simply could not settle. Something pacing back and forth with unfinished business weighing on it too heavily to let it rest. Around this same time, my husband and I finally sat down and had a real conversation about everything that had been happening. No longer half asleep, no longer brushing it off with sleepy dismissals in the middle of the night. We laid it all out together, his repeated warnings about the voice in my sister's room, my own experience in the kitchen, the reflection in the hallway mirror, and slowly, piece by piece, we both admitted to each other that we didn't think we were imagining any of it. Something was happening in that house. Something connected specifically to my sister. Something that our father, even in death, seemed desperate for us to notice. That realization pushed me to finally have a real conversation with my sister herself, something I had been avoiding without fully understanding why. Maybe because some deep protective part of me already sensed that whatever answer I got was going to change everything. I sat her down one evening after my daughter had gone to sleep, just the two of us in the quiet of that old farmhouse, and I asked her directly whether anything strange had been happening to her, whether she'd noticed anything unusual in her room at night, whether she remembered hearing any voices while she slept. She looked at me with genuine confusion, insisting she remembered nothing at all. No voices, no disturbances, nothing out of the ordinary happening while she slept. She swore up and down that she had no memory of speaking to anyone in the night, no memory of our father's voice, nothing. And I believed her, because there was no reason not to, because the confusion on her face was too genuine to be an act. But something about the conversation cracked open a door that had clearly been closed for a long time. And once that door was open, even slightly, the truth she had been carrying started coming out. It came to light, slowly and painfully, over that conversation, and the ones that followed in the days after, that my sister had been the victim of ongoing sexual abuse. Something happening to her in that house that none of the rest of us had known about. Something she had been carrying entirely on her own in silence. The full weight of that discovery is something I still can't fully put into words even now. The horror of realizing that something so devastating had been happening under our own roof without any of us seeing it, without any of us protecting her the way we should have. And that is when everything that had been happening finally made a horrible, undeniable kind of sense. The voice waking my husband in the dead of night, warning him over and over that a male presence was in her room. My father's voice cutting through an ordinary afternoon to tell me directly that something was wrong with her. The reflection in that hallway mirror, appearing again and again just outside her bedroom door, restless and unable to settle. My father, even after death, even without a body, even without any conventional way of protecting the daughter he had left behind, had been doing the only thing a parent instinctively does when their child is in danger. He was trying to warn us. He was trying to protect her the only way he had left, standing watch outside her door, forcing his voice through whatever barrier separates the living from the dead, refusing to rest until someone finally listened closely enough to understand what he was trying to say. Once the truth came out, once we understood what had actually been happening in that house, the disturbances stopped almost entirely. The voice that used to wake my husband in the night went quiet. The reflection in the hallway mirror stopped appearing. It was as if my father, having finally accomplished what he needed to accomplish, having finally gotten through to us in the only way left available to him, was able to rest. I don't know exactly how to explain what happened in that house during those months, And I don't think I ever will fully understand the mechanics of it. How a voice can carry through a house long after the person who owned it has been buried. How a reflection can appear in a mirror with no one standing there to cast it. All I know is that something in that farmhouse refused to let my sisters suffer in silence, refused to let the rest of us stay blind to what was happening right under our own roof, and pushed through whatever wall exists between this world and whatever comes after it, until someone finally heard him clearly enough to act. We eventually moved away from that farmland, for reasons that had as much to do with healing as anything else, but I think about those months often, especially now that my daughter has grown old enough to ask questions about the grandfather she never really got the chance to know. I tell her, when she asks, that her grandfather was the kind of man who never stopped watching over the people he loved, not even after he was gone, and that some part of him found a way to reach back through the silence and speak when it mattered most. I still don't fully understand what happened in that house, and some part of me doesn't think I'm meant to, but I know what I heard standing in that kitchen with a knife in my hand and a bowl of potatoes in front of me. I know what my husband heard over and over in the dead of night, weeks before either of us understood why. And I know that whatever protection a father can offer his children, even from beyond the grave, my father found a way to give it, refusing to let his daughter carry that darkness alone, refusing to rest until the rest of us were finally listening. When my brother was little, he had what everyone in the family assumed was just an imaginary friend, the kind of thing so many small children invent for themselves during that stretch of early childhood when the line between pretend and real hasn't fully solidified yet. It seemed harmless at first, even sweet in a way, the kind of quirky detail parents love to bring up years later at family gatherings, laughing about the strange little habits their kids had before they grew out of them. My brother would spend hours playing with this imaginary companion, talking to him, running around the house with him, treating him as real and present as any flesh and blood friend he might have had at school. For a long time, none of us thought twice about it. Kids do this. Kids invent whole worlds and whole people to populate them, and most of the time it means absolutely nothing beyond a healthy, active imagination. But even in those early years, there were small moments that, looking back now, feel like they should have raised more alarm than they did at the time. My brother wasn't always happy playing with this so-called imaginary friend. There were moments, scattered here and there through his early childhood, where his tone would shift entirely, where the playful energy he usually had during these games would suddenly curdle into something closer to distress. He would snap out, seemingly at nothing, saying things like, "Stop, leave me alone," his little voice taking on an edge of genuine frustration or fear that didn't fit the light-hearted, imaginative play my mom assumed was happening. Other times, completely out of nowhere, he would dig his heels in and refuse to go play in his own room, insisting, "No, I don't want to go to my room to play," with a stubbornness that seemed disproportionate to whatever imaginary game was supposedly happening in there. My mom, like most parents would in that situation, chalked it up to typical childhood behavior, the kind of overactive imagination that sometimes tips over into a kid scaring themselves with their own made-up stories. Whenever she noticed him getting upset like that, she would ask him gently what was going on, trying to understand what part of his imaginary game had suddenly turned sour. And every time, without fail, his answer was the same unsettling little sentence, delivered with a frustration that felt too specific, too consistent, to be pure invention. "He won't leave me alone." Not he's being annoying, not he wants to keep playing when I'm tired of the game, just that one recurring phrase, "He won't leave me alone," repeated over months and possibly years of his early childhood. A phrase that in hindsight carries a weight none of us were prepared to give it. back then. Of course, at the time, none of this seemed like cause for real concern. Parents hear all kinds of strange, half-formed complaints from small children about imaginary friends, imaginary monsters, imaginary rules to games that only exist in a toddler's head. And most of it is exactly what it appears to be. Nothing more than the ordinary noise of a developing imagination. My mom would nod along, maybe gently suggest he take a break from playing with his friend if he seemed upset, and life would move on as it always does in a busy household full of daily distractions. Nobody sat down and seriously entertained the idea that something more than imagination might be behind those complaints. Why would they? It's such an easy thing to dismiss, right up until something happens that makes dismissing it completely impossible. That something happened the day after my brother's birthday. He was still just a small child at the time, young enough that basic physical realities of his size mattered a great deal to how this whole event unfolded. Young enough that reaching high shelves, countertops, or anything positioned above his own limited height was simply not something he was physically capable of doing on his own. His birthday had just passed, and the house was still decorated with the leftover evidence of the celebration. Balloons scattered around, some tied down, some just floating loosely near the ceiling in, that slow, sagging way balloons do a day or two after a party, once the helium starts to lose its lift. Among the party leftovers sitting around were also things that had been used for the celebration itself. Plates, forks, knives, the ordinary tools you'd expect to find after any birthday gathering involving cake and food, all of which had been placed up on counters and surfaces well out of my brother's reach. Exactly where you'd expect responsible parents to keep sharp utensils away from a small child who had no business handling them unsupervised. It was late that night, somewhere around 10 or 11 o'clock, well past the kind of hour a small child should reasonably be up and unsupervised outside. My mom was inside the house when she heard a sudden, sharp popping sound coming from outside, the unmistakable sound of balloons bursting one after another. Concerned, she went outside to check what was going on and found my brother standing there among the popped remains of several balloons, looking utterly terrified, his small face pale and shaken in a way that immediately told her something was very wrong. She asked him directly what had happened, whether he had been the one to pop the balloons himself, a completely reasonable question given that he was standing right there among the wreckage. But my brother, clearly frightened, insisted immediately and firmly that it wasn't him. No, he said, panic edging into his little voice. It was him, pointing toward empty space beside him, gesturing at the same invisible imaginary friend that had been part of his life for as long as anyone could remember, the same friend my mom had never been able to see, hear, or in any way perceive for herself. And then my mom saw it. Lying right there next to the popped balloons was a knife, one of the knives from the birthday party, one of the utensils that had been placed up on a surface specifically because it was out of my brother's reach. In that instant, the pieces clicked together for her in a way they never had before. Her son was small, too small physically to reach the surface that knife had been resting on, too small to reach the balloons that had been tied up higher than his own height. There was no way, physically, for a child his size and age to have done what had apparently just been done. Popping balloons with a knife that had been placed well beyond his reach only hours earlier. Something shifted in her at that moment. Some instinctive parental recognition that this had gone beyond ordinary childhood imagination. That whatever had just happened in that yard involved something real enough to interact with physical objects in ways her small son simply could not have managed on his own. And in that instant, without fully processing the implications of what she was doing, She turned toward the empty space beside my brother, the space he had been pointing at, the space where his invisible friend apparently stood, and she shouted, with a ferocity that surprised even her, "Get out of my house." She couldn't see anything there. To her eyes, there was nothing but empty night air standing beside her frightened son. But she shouted at it anyway, with the full force of a mother's protective instinct kicking in ahead of any rational explanation her mind could offer for what she was even yelling at. And then, because she genuinely had no way of confirming for herself whether whatever she just shouted at was still there or not, she turned to my brother and asked him directly whether it had left yet. My brother, still shaken, told her that it had left, and even added in that strange, matter-of-fact way that children sometimes report things far stranger than adults would ever say out loud, that it had thanked her on its way out. That detail alone should tell you everything about how unsettling that night truly was. Not fled in fear, not vanished the way you'd hope a threatening presence might after being confronted, but thanked her, as if acknowledging the interaction, as if there had been some kind of understanding passed between them, despite one side of that exchange being completely invisible to the person doing the shouting. The night didn't end there, though, and what happened next brought a completely separate witness into the story. Someone with no prior knowledge of my brother's invisible friend, no context for any of what had already happened that evening, no reason at all to expect anything unusual. About 10 or 15 minutes after that confrontation in the yard, my cousins arrived at the house for a visit, walking up to the front door the way they always did. One of my cousins later described, completely unprompted, seeing a woman standing at the front door as they approached. A woman dressed entirely in white, her hair hanging down over her face in a way that obscured her features entirely, leaving nothing visible beneath that pale curtain of hair. My cousin had no way of knowing about the imaginary friend, no way of knowing about the balloons or the knife or the shouting that had just happened in the yard only minutes earlier. This was simply what he saw standing at the door as he walked up to the house that night. A strange, silent woman in white, with her face completely hidden. When my cousin mentioned this figure to my brother, describing the woman standing right there at the front door, my brother's response was immediate and unnervingly casual. He said, without missing a beat, that it was his mom, referring not to my actual mother, but to some other figure entirely. Some presence he apparently associated with the same invisible companion that had been part of his life for years. This detail complicates the entire story in a deeply unsettling way, suggesting that whatever had been present in my brother's life wasn't simply a solitary imaginary friend, but potentially something connected to, or accompanied by, this other figure entirely, a woman in white that my brother seemed to recognize instantly and describe using an unsettlingly intimate term. My actual mother, hearing all of this unfold, opened the front door herself. By that point, my cousins had already stepped inside the house, having pushed past whatever had been standing at the entrance, and my mom, now standing in the doorway herself, turned to my brother and asked him directly whether the woman was still there. My brother said yes, and he added one more detail that has stuck with everyone in the family since that night. He said that she was mad. That detail changes the entire tone of this story from something merely strange into something closer to genuinely threatening. A silent figure standing at a doorway is unsettling enough on its own. A figure that a small child specifically describes as angry. Standing right there at the threshold of the family home is an entirely different level of alarming. My mom didn't hesitate. She began yelling at this presence too, just as she had done in the yard only minutes before, demanding that it get out, refusing to let whatever was standing there believe it had any claim over her home or her children. After yelling at it for some time, she once again turned to my brother, asking him whether the figure was still there. This time, he told her that it was gone. The house grew quiet after that. The rest of the night passed without further incident, at least nothing dramatic enough to be reported the way the balloon popping and the woman at the door had been. But the story doesn't end that night, and this is the part that unsettles me most whenever I think about the whole thing as an adult, looking back on my brother's childhood with a clearer, less dismissive perspective than any of us had at the time. My brother is 19 years old now, a grown man, well past the age where you'd expect any lingering trace of a childhood imaginary friend to still hold any real presence in his life. And yet, even now, he says that he still occasionally sees the same figure, the same presence that used to follow him around as a small child, appearing to him now in the reflection of mirrors. Not constantly, not in any predictable pattern that he's ever been able to describe in detail, but often enough, consistently enough over all these years, that he's never been able to fully write it off as some overactive imagination he simply failed to grow out of. Whatever accompanied my brother through those early years of his childhood clearly didn't belong to the ordinary category of imaginary friends that so many kids invent and eventually forget. It interacted with physical objects in ways a small child physically couldn't have managed himself. It was witnessed independently, without any prior knowledge or suggestion, by someone with no connection to my brother's private childhood world, in the form of a silent, faceless woman standing at our front door late at night. And whatever it was, it has apparently never fully left, resurfacing even now, all these years later, in the reflective surface of mirrors, a presence my brother has learned to live alongside without ever fully understanding what it is or why it chose him in the first place. I think about this story often, mostly because of how ordinary it sounded at the very beginning. Just a kid with an imaginary friend, the kind of story every family has some version of. It's only when you sit with the details long enough, the popped balloons, the knife placed well out of a toddler's reach, the woman in white witnessed independently by someone outside the family, the casual, chilling way my brother described her as mad, that the full weight of what actually happened that night settles in. Somewhere in the space between an ordinary childhood imagination and something far harder to explain, my family encountered something that never fully left. Something that followed my brother quietly into adulthood, waiting patiently in mirrors for him to notice it again. Over the years, our family has talked about that night more times than I can count, usually at gatherings, usually late in the evening when the conversation naturally drifts toward the strange and unexplained things that have happened to us. Every single time it comes up, someone in the room brings a slightly different piece of the story to the table. A detail they remembered that nobody else quite recalled, or a small observation from that period of my brother's childhood that seemed insignificant at the time, but feels heavier in hindsight. My mom, for instance, has mentioned more than once that in the weeks leading up to that birthday, she'd noticed my brother talking to himself in his room at strange hours. Not the usual chatter of a child playing pretend, but hushed, serious conversations that seemed to carry an odd tension to them. The kind of tone you'd expect from someone negotiating rather than playing. My cousin, the one who saw the woman in white standing at the door, has never really wanted to talk about it in much detail since that night. Whenever it comes up, he tends to go quiet, or he changes the subject fairly quickly, and the one thing he has said, on the rare occasions he's willing to discuss it at all, is that he has never forgotten how still she was. Not swaying, not shifting her weight the way a person naturally does even while standing in one place. Just completely, unnaturally still, like a photograph of a person rather than an actual living, breathing one standing at our front door in the middle of the night. He said the stillness bothered him more than anything else about the encounter. More than the fact that her face had been completely hidden behind that curtain of pale hair, more than the late hour or the strangeness of finding an unfamiliar woman standing right at the entrance of a house he was simply visiting for the evening. For a long time after that birthday, my brother's behavior around his imaginary friend changed noticeably, according to my mom. He didn't stop mentioning him entirely, but he became far more guarded about it, far less willing to talk openly about their so-called games the way he used to before that night. If my mom asked him directly whether his friend had been around recently, he would often just shrug or give a short, non-committal answer, nothing like the enthusiastic chatter he used to offer freely before that birthday. It was as if something about that night had changed the nature of whatever relationship existed between my brother and this presence, shifting it from something almost playful into something quieter, more private, something he no longer felt comfortable sharing so openly with the adults around him. As he got older, into his teenage years, the subject came up less and less, mostly because life simply moves on, and childhood strangeness tends to get filed away as just another odd story from a person's early years. The kind of thing families joke about without really examining too closely. It wasn't until he was much older, well into his teenage years, that he first mentioned, almost offhandedly, that he still occasionally caught glimpses of something in mirrors, a presence lingering just at the edge of his reflection that would vanish the instant he turned to look directly at it. He didn't seem particularly alarmed when he first brought it up, treating it almost as a strange but familiar quirk of his own life rather than something worth investigating or fearing, which in some ways made the rest of us more uneasy than if he'd reacted with genuine fear himself. Now, at 19, he describes these mirror sightings with the same calm, matter-of-fact tone he used as a small child describing his imaginary friend, the same tone that once told my mom, without any apparent distress, that the presence in the yard had thanked her before leaving. He doesn't dwell on it, doesn't seem to carry any particular dread about it, but he has said more than once that he doesn't think whatever followed him as a child ever actually left. Not completely. Not the way we all hoped it had after that strange, frightening night with the balloons and the woman at the door. He believes it simply learned, eventually, to stay quieter, to reveal itself less often, to exist at the margins of his life rather than at its center the way it once had when he was small enough to still openly talk to it as a friend. None of us have ever been able to explain any of it with any real certainty. Not the popped balloons, not the knife that ended up somewhere it had no business being, not the woman in white that a completely uninvolved witness described independently on the very same night. And certainly not whatever it is that still occasionally shows itself in the reflection of a grown man's mirror decades after. It first appeared to him as an invisible companion in early childhood. All any of us really have is the accumulated weight of these small, strange, disconnected details, each one impossible to dismiss entirely on its own, and together forming a story none of us have ever been able to fully put to rest. It was there, on that same stretch of open land known simply as the Heath, where my mama and her brothers and sisters had played as children themselves, and it was there, decades before it ever happened to us, that the same old fear had already taken root in them. They told us about it more than once over the years, always with the same serious tone, always insisting that whatever had spooked them and their friends back then was every bit as real and unsettling as whatever ended up happening to us. It's strange, thinking back now, how a piece of land can carry the same dread across generations, passed down almost like an inheritance nobody actually wants. And yet none of us kids ever thought twice about accepting it as simply part of growing up in that family, in that place. It happened on a scorching hot day one summer, right in the middle of the school holidays, the kind of stretch of long, empty days where kids run out of things to do fairly quickly and start driving the adults around them a little bit mad with boredom and mischief. For whatever reason, the older boys in the family were home that particular day, which almost never happened during the summer since they usually had their own plans, their own friends, their own teenage lives to attend to. But that day they were around, and all of us younger cousins, myself included, were being thoroughly troublesome, the way small children get when they've got too much energy and nowhere in particular to put it. Eventually the boys, probably more out of self-preservation than generosity, announced that they'd take the lot of us blackberry picking just to get us out from underfoot for a few hours. My mama agreed immediately and gratefully, without a second thought, because despite being 16, 17, and 18, the older boys had a reputation in the family for being unusually responsible and mature for their age. They'd been babysitting us younger kids for years by that point, and all of us knew the unspoken rules that came with being taken out anywhere by them. Stay close. Listen to what they say. Don't wander off. It wasn't even something that needed repeating at that point. It was just understood. About half an hour later, everyone had gathered their fruit buckets, and off we went, the whole noisy little group of us trailing behind the 3 older boys. There were 5 of us younger kids all together that day, and all of us were properly excited, because blackberry picking was one of those activities that had become something of a family tradition, something we all genuinely loved doing together every summer. Part of the appeal, if I'm honest, was knowing exactly what awaited us afterward, because our Gran made the best blackberry pies any of us had ever tasted. And the promise of that pie waiting for us at the end of the day made the whole outing feel even more worth it. My Gran's house backed directly onto the edge of the heath, with nothing separating her garden from the open land beyond except a low fence that had a gap at one end, just wide enough for kids to squeeze through if you knew where to look. One of my older cousins passed me through that gap first, since I used a wheelchair and couldn't manage getting through on my own, and then he lifted my little wheelchair over the fence after me, careful and practiced in the way people are when they've done something 100 times before. The other kids scrambled through in a matter of seconds, and just like that, we were off. The whole group of us moving out onto the open ground of the heath. As we made our way toward the blackberry field, the older boys did what they always did on these little expeditions, telling us spooky stories along the way, half because they genuinely enjoyed scaring us, and half because, if we're being completely honest, we always begged them to do it anyway. Out of all the older cousins, H&B in particular had a reputation for being absolute masters at storytelling, so convincing and detailed in the way they told things that even stories we all knew weren't strictly true still managed to send chills down our spines every single time. We loved every second of it, even while clutching each other's hands a little tighter and glancing nervously into the bushes as we walked. But there was one place on that route where all the talking, all the storytelling, all the laughing and teasing between us would fall completely silent without anyone ever needing to say a word about it. That was when we reached the waterhouse. Nobody, and I mean absolutely nobody, ever spoke while passing near the waterhouse. Not even the older boys who otherwise feared nothing and delighted in mocking anything the rest of us found frightening. There was something about that place, something in the way it looked, that made silence feel like the only appropriate response. It was just a piece of industrial infrastructure, really, some kind of old waterworks building tucked away on the heath. Nothing inherently supernatural about its actual function or purpose. And yet it always looked wrong somehow, unsettling in a way that's hard to properly explain unless you'd stood in front of it yourself, and it still looks that way even now, all these years later. Beyond the waterhouse, there was a second fence we had to get through before reaching the blackberry field we were actually headed toward, and every single time we squeezed through that gap, all of us kids went noticeably quieter, more serious, remembering as we did the old story, the local legend, the piece of family folklore that every single one of us had grown up hearing in bits and pieces over the years. The story went like this. Sometime in the early 1960s, there had been a gang of bank robbers operating in the local area, men with a genuinely nasty reputation. The kind of criminals who didn't just rob banks quietly and slip away, but who terrorized everyone inside while doing it, staff and customers alike, grabbing and shooting anything that moved if it got in their way. They'd apparently pulled off several successful jobs over time without ever getting caught, building up a reputation of fear around themselves in the process. But eventually, on one particular job, everything went badly wrong. In the chaos of it, a sweet 19-year-old trainee bank clerk, someone barely out of school herself, ended up shot dead, along with 5 other people who were seriously injured in the crossfire that followed. One of the gang members himself was killed during that same botched robbery, and the nastiest member of the group, the one apparently responsible for most of the violence, was seriously wounded as well. According to the story, the surviving members of the gang managed to escape with only a few £100s to show for the whole disaster. And in their desperation to disappear, they made their way out to the heath and hid themselves inside the waterhouse, which back then was still a relatively new structure, freshly built and perfect for exactly this kind of desperate hideaway. What happened after that, according to the legend, was that tension and paranoia between the surviving gang members grew unbearable in the days and weeks that followed. Nobody ever quite explained how it actually happened, but months later, the bodies of all 3 remaining gang members were discovered inside the waterhouse, already decomposing, left to rot away in that hiding place they thought would keep them safe. Whatever had happened between them in that time, whether it was betrayal, paranoia, or something else entirely, none of them survived it. A few years after that grim discovery, strange things reportedly began happening in and around the waterhouse. People spoke of glimpsing mysterious hairy figures moving stealthily among the pipes and wiring inside the structure, always caught from the corner of the eye, never quite confirmed directly. A dank, moldy, rotten smell, something people compared to aging river weeds left to fester, seemed to hang permanently around the building, regardless of the season or weather. And at all hours of the day and night, eerie wails and low, menacing murmurs were said to drift out from somewhere inside or around the structure, unsettling enough that people avoided lingering nearby even in broad daylight. By the late 70s, there had reportedly been a spate of mysterious deaths among homeless people who used to shelter on the heath, not far from the waterhouse itself. Nothing was ever officially linked to the building, no evidence, no investigation that pointed directly at it, but the locals in the area had heard enough by that point, and they simply started giving the waterhouse and the land surrounding it as wide a berth as they possibly could. That growing avoidance, born out of a mixture of dark history and creeping superstition, left the waterhouse abandoned and steadily falling into disrepair over the following years, a crumbling, forgotten structure that nobody wanted to go near. That was the entirety of what we knew, what had been passed down to us kids over years of family storytelling about the waterhouse's dark and unsettling history. That was exactly why we were all so wary, so eager to hurry past it as quickly as our legs could carry us every single time we made this same walk toward the blackberry field. Once we'd all made it through the gap in the second fence, putting a comfortable distance between ourselves and the waterhouse, we younger cousins finally worked up enough nerve to glance back over our shoulders at the building itself, just for a moment, before the older boys rounded us all up again and got us moving properly toward our destination. One of my cousins lifted me back into my wheelchair, and off we went the rest of the way to the blackberry field without any further hesitation. We reached the field not long after, finding a few other local kids already there ahead of us, kids we knew well enough from around the area. We spent a genuinely lovely afternoon together after that, picking blackberries straight off the bushes, eating plenty of them right there on the spot before they ever made it into our buckets, splashing around in the nearby river to cool off from the summer heat. Time passed the way it always does on good days like that, quickly and without anyone really noticing, until eventually the sun began sinking lower in the sky, and it was time to start heading home. The journey back followed much the same pattern as the walk there had, with plenty of bantering and laughing between us all, the older boys still teasing and winding us up in that easy, familiar way older siblings and cousins do. But as the evening wore on and tiredness started creeping into all of our legs, the mood shifted slightly, growing a little quieter, a little more subdued than it had been earlier that day. By the time we reached the fence just before the waterhouse again, something about the air itself felt different, heavier somehow. The kind of close, tense stillness you get right before a summer thunderstorm rolls in, even though there wasn't a cloud in sight. The youngest of the three older boys lifted me out of my wheelchair so that B could pass it over the fence properly, while the rest of the kids had already made it through to the other side where H and B were waiting. It was in that brief pause, right there by the fence, that everything changed. A, in a low, guarded voice, completely unlike his usual playful tone, said to his brother, "Something moved at the back of there." Bruv, B turned and looked at him sideways at first, half expecting one of A's usual pranks, since out of all the boys, A was easily the most likely one to try pulling a stunt just to get a laugh out of everyone, but this time A's face was completely serious. None of the usual mischief in his expression at all. I said, "I'm going to have a look," and passed me through to B before squeezing past the rest of us toward the waterhouse itself. "Wait up, A, we've got tea," B started to say, having just settled me back into my wheelchair, moving forward slightly to follow his brother. But before he could finish that sentence, all of us heard A shriek out, a sound full of genuine horror and disgust, and both boys immediately stumbled backward, away from the building. H, who had already lifted me back out of my wheelchair at some point in the confusion, shouted for everyone to run, and we did exactly that without a second's hesitation. B scooped up my folded wheelchair as we ran. A grabbed the hands of the two other kids nearby and followed close behind, while H carried me on his shoulders with one hand, holding my other cousin's hand with the other as we all bolted away from that place as fast as our legs would carry us. I kept shouting over and over, "Don't look back, don't look back." But I did anyway, twisting to glance behind us despite everything, and I saw nothing there myself. Nothing at all in that brief backward glance. We didn't stop running until we reached the fence that led back out to the road on the housing estate, the point where we could finally see proper civilization again, streetlights and houses, and the ordinary safety of the world we knew. By the time we got there, every single one of us was completely out of breath, especially the older boys who'd been carrying both fear and physical exertion the entire way. Before we slipped back through that final fence onto the road, B, leaning heavily against the railings to catch his breath, finally turned to his brother and asked, "What did you see?" "A," I answered in a shaking, broken voice, barely getting the words out between breaths. "Yellow eyes," he said, hairy face. The moment those words left his mouth, every single one of us younger kids completely lost it, panicking and screaming, the fear finally breaking through all at once now that we had a specific, terrifying image to attach to what we'd all just experienced. H had to work hard to calm everyone down, insisting over and over that we were safe now, that everything would be all right. But none of us wanted anything more than to get as far away from that place as humanly possible, and to never think about the Waterhouse again, if we could help it. By the time we made it home, all of us looked thoroughly bedraggled and visibly on edge. Dirt and sweat and fear written all over our faces in a way that was impossible to hide from the adults waiting for us. My mama and my auntie noticed immediately, of course, and asked the boys directly what had happened out there. H, thinking quickly, simply told them we'd gotten spooked by some old drunk man wandering through the bushes looking for golf balls to sell. A fairly ordinary and believable excuse given how common that kind of thing actually was around the heath. My mama and auntie, satisfied with that explanation, gave us all a gentle talking to about being careful, and gave us each a comforting hug before sending us off to wash up and calm down properly. None of us ever told my mama or my auntie the real truth about what had actually happened that evening. About the yellow eyes and the hairy face that A had described in that shaking, broken voice by the fence. We never found out, not then, and not in all the years since, exactly what it was that A had seen lurking at the back of that building. For weeks afterward, none of us kids wanted to go anywhere near that part of the heath, and even mentioning blackberries at the dinner table was enough to make at least one of us go quiet and stare down at our plates. Eventually, as children do, we started to forget the sharp edges of that fear. Or at least we learned to bury it well enough to carry on with ordinary summer life. But none of us ever fully stopped believing what we'd seen and heard that evening. Every single one of us, even years later as grown adults with families of our own, still agrees on the same basic facts whenever the story comes up, which it does fairly often at family gatherings, usually late at night when someone brings up old ghost stories and somebody else inevitably says, "Go on then. Tell them about the Waterhouse." Himself has never really elaborated much further on what he saw that night, even now as a grown man well into his adult life. Whenever pressed, he tends to go quiet, the same way my cousin did with the woman in white, repeating only the same handful of details he gave us that evening by the fence, the yellow eyes catching whatever last light remained in the fading dusk, the thick, matted hair covering a face he never managed to properly make out before the horror of it sent him stumbling backward. He has said, on the rare occasions he's willing to discuss it honestly, that whatever he saw wasn't an animal. Not in the ordinary sense, anyway, though he has never been able to offer a better word for it than that. B, for his part, has always maintained that he heard something too in that same instant. A low, wet, guttural sound coming from somewhere deep inside the structure, right before his brother screamed. Something he has described as sounding almost like breathing, if breathing could somehow carry the weight of decades of rot and stagnant water behind it. Gran's house is long gone now, sold off years ago after she passed, and the heath itself has changed considerably since we were children running wild across it every summer. But the Waterhouse, as far as any of us know, is still standing out there, crumbling further with each passing year, avoided just as thoroughly by the newer generation of local kids as it ever was by us. Sometimes I wonder whether those children, growing up nearby without any of us there to warn them, have their own version of that same old story passed down to them by parents and neighbors who've long since stopped questioning why exactly that particular building deserves such a wide, careful berth. I imagine they do. Some places simply hold on to their reputation, generation after generation, whether or not anyone still remembers precisely why. It happened when I was 11 years old, back during a stretch of my life when I was, if I'm being completely honest, something of a problem child. I had a habit that drove my parents up the wall at the time. staying up long after everyone else in the house had gone to sleep, sneaking hours of quiet solitude for myself while the rest of the household lay unconscious around me. Looking back now, it seems like such a small, harmless kind of rebellion. Just a kid refusing to sleep on time. But that one stubborn habit ended up putting me directly in the path of something I have never been able to fully explain. Something that still surfaces in my memory whenever the house goes quiet enough at night. My bedroom back then was positioned in a particular way that mattered a great deal to what happened. In a way I never really thought about, until that night forced me to. If you opened the door to my room, you had a completely unobstructed view straight down a long corridor that ran through the rest of the house. A corridor so long that it swallowed up whatever light might have otherwise reached it after dark. During the day, that corridor was just an ordinary hallway. Nothing remarkable about it at all. Just a stretch of floor connecting one part of the house to another. But at night, once the lights were off and the rest of the family had gone to bed, that same corridor became something else entirely. A long tunnel of absolute darkness that light simply couldn't reach, stretching out from my doorway into a blackness so complete that you couldn't make out even the vaguest shapes of the furniture or doorways lining its length. That particular night started out exactly like countless other nights before it. I was sitting cross-legged on my bed with a drawing album open in front of me, completely absorbed in whatever sketch I was working on at the time, the kind of aimless, contented focus kids get lost in during those quiet hours when they're supposed to be asleep, but aren't. The house around me was silent in that particular deep, settled way houses get once everyone inside them has been asleep for hours. The kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses gently against your ears until you almost forget what ordinary background noise even sounds like. At some point, without any particular reason prompting me to do so, I looked up from my drawing and glanced toward my open bedroom door. And there, standing in the corridor, directly within my line of sight, was something that should not have been there at all. Whatever it was stood roughly at the height of an 8 or 9-year-old child. Small compared to an adult, but clearly not small enough to be a toy or some trick of shadow and imagination working on a half-asleep mind. It was standing there, motionless, right out in that long stretch of pitch-black corridor, and somehow, despite the near-total darkness that swallowed everything else along that hallway, I could see it clearly enough to register its presence and rough shape. And beside it, or perhaps attached to it in some way I couldn't quite make sense of at the time, was a long red bag. The kind of detail that seems almost mundane on its own, but that has stuck with me far more vividly over the years than it probably should, precisely because it made no sense next to everything else about that moment. At first, my mind simply refused to process what I was looking at. I blinked hard, several times in a row, the way you do when you're convinced your eyes are playing some kind of trick on you, some artifact of tiredness, or the low light in the room deceiving your vision. I rubbed at my eyes with the heels of my hands, hard enough that spots of color bloomed briefly behind my eyelids, genuinely trying every physical trick I could think of to make the image in front of me simply dissolve back into ordinary darkness, the way an afterimage or a trick of shadow normally would. But it didn't dissolve. It didn't waver or shift the way real optical illusions tend to when you blink hard enough or rub your eyes enough times. It just remained there, standing perfectly still in that corridor, exactly where it had been the moment I first looked up, as solid and unmoving as if it had every right to be standing there in my house in the middle of the night. It was somewhere in the middle of all that frantic blinking and eye-rubbing that a genuinely terrifying thought cut through my confusion and settled cold in my stomach. What if it isn't just something I'm imagining at all? What if this is real, actually standing there, actually watching me from that corridor, and no amount of blinking or rubbing my eyes is going to make it disappear, because there's nothing wrong with my eyes in the first place. I had absolutely no idea what to do with that thought once it arrived. I was 11 years old, alone in my room in the middle of the night, with something standing in my doorway that I could not explain, could not identify, and could not fully convince myself I was only imagining. Every instinct in me wanted to scream, to bolt out of bed and run for my parents' room, but some other instinct, some deeper, more primal sense of self-preservation, told me that moving suddenly, drawing further attention to myself, was possibly the worst thing I could do in that moment. So instead, I did the only thing that felt survivable. I turned back toward my desk, away from the door, away from that long, dark corridor and whatever was standing in it, and I tried with everything I had to convince myself that if I simply didn't look at it, didn't acknowledge it, it would somehow lose interest, or cease to matter, or perhaps even cease to exist entirely, the way monsters under a child's bed are supposed to vanish the moment you stop believing in them. Except I couldn't actually make myself stop thinking about it, not even for a second. My whole body sat rigid at that desk, ostensibly facing my drawing again, but every ounce of my attention was locked entirely on the open doorway behind me. On the corridor I could no longer see, but knew, with absolute certainty, was still occupied by whatever had been standing there a moment before. I strained my ears for any sound at all that might tell me what was happening back there. Footsteps, breathing, the rustle of that strange red bag shifting against the floor. Anything. But there was nothing. No sound reached me from that corridor at all. No shuffle of movement. No creak of the old floorboards that ran the length of that hallway and normally complained under even the lightest footstep. The only sound in the entire world, as far as I could tell in that moment, was the frantic, thudding rhythm of my own heartbeat, pounding so loudly in my ears that it felt like the loudest thing in the house, maybe the loudest thing in existence, drowning out every other possible sound I might have needed to hear to keep myself safe. I don't know exactly how long I sat like that, rigid and unmoving at my desk, refusing to turn around, refusing to acknowledge the presence I was certain was still standing in that doorway behind me. It felt like an eternity, though I'm sure in reality it was probably only a handful of minutes. Minutes that stretched and warped under the weight of that fear into something that felt endless. My pencil sat useless in my hand, no longer moving across the page, my eyes fixed on the same small patch of paper without actually seeing any of it. Every part of my attention consumed entirely by the effort of not turning around. Eventually, breaking through that suffocating silence, I heard something, footsteps, distant at first, somewhere further down the house, growing gradually closer with each passing second. My whole body tensed even further at the sound, my mind racing through every horrifying possibility of what those approaching footsteps might mean, whether they belonged to whatever had been standing in my doorway, finally deciding to move, finally deciding to come closer instead of simply watching from a distance. I did not dare turn around to check. Every part of me screamed to look, to know what was coming, and every part of me refused, frozen by the certainty that whatever I might see if I turned would be so much worse than simply not knowing. The footsteps grew closer, steady and unhurried, moving with the ordinary weight and rhythm of a normal person walking, rather than anything sliding or creeping the way I'd imagined whatever stood in the corridor might move if it decided to approach. And then, finally, a familiar voice cut through my fear, breaking the tension that had wound so tightly through my whole body that I hadn't even realized how hard I'd been holding my breath until it released all at once. It was my mother. She had woken up, for whatever reason, and made her way down that same long corridor toward my room, discovering the light still on under my door, and predictably, immediately annoyed to find me still awake at such a late hour instead of asleep like I was supposed to be. She came into my room and scolded me, her voice carrying that familiar, weary exasperation parents get when dealing with a child who simply won't cooperate with a reasonable bedtime, telling me in no uncertain terms that I needed to put the album away and go to sleep immediately. I remember sitting there, listening to her scold me, and feeling an almost dizzying wave of relief wash over the fear that had gripped me only moments before. Relief so intense, it nearly made me laugh out loud in the middle of being told off. I didn't dare mention what I had seen standing in the corridor just minutes earlier. I don't think, at 11 years old, half convinced I'd imagined the whole thing anyway, and half terrified that saying it out loud might somehow make it more real, I had any intention of bringing it up at all. I just nodded along to her scolding, promised to go to sleep, and once she left my room, satisfied that her job as an exhausted, irritated parent was done. I finally worked up the nerve to glance back toward that open doorway. The corridor was empty. Whatever had been standing there, that small, motionless figure, roughly the size of an 8 or 9-year-old child, holding or standing beside that strange, long red bag, was simply gone, without a trace, without any sign that it had ever been there at all beyond the memory now burned permanently into my mind. I have never seen anything like that again in all the years since that night. Not before it, and not after it. And I have never come any closer to understanding what exactly I saw standing in that corridor all those years ago. I've turned the memory over countless times as an adult, trying to apply some rational explanation to it the way adults instinctively try to do with childhood fears, telling myself it must have been a trick of exhaustion, some half-formed hallucination born from a tired mind staying up far too late, or perhaps some oddly shaped shadow cast by furniture or clothing left out in the hallway that my imagination filled in with a shape and size that wasn't really there at all. But none of those explanations ever quite fit. Not entirely. Not in a way that lets me fully set the memory aside the way I've managed to do with so many other ordinary childhood fears over the years. What stays with me most, more than the shape itself, more than its unsettling stillness, is that detail of the red bag. So specific, so oddly mundane, sitting there beside something I otherwise couldn't explain at all. It's the kind of detail that feels far too particular to have simply been invented by a tired, frightened imagination, and yet it's also a detail I have never been able to make any sense of, never found any explanation for, no matter how many times I've tried to piece together what exactly I might have witnessed that night. To this day, whenever I find myself alone in a quiet house late at night, and I catch myself glancing toward a dark hallway or an open doorway leading into shadow, some small, stubborn part of my mind still braces itself, half expecting to see that same still small shape standing there once again, waiting patiently in the dark the way it had that night so many years ago. Silent, motionless, and utterly without explanation. I have told this story to a handful of people over the years, usually late at night, usually when the conversation has already drifted toward the strange and unexplained things that have happened to people we know. Most of them respond the way you'd expect, offering some gentle, practical explanation, suggesting it was probably just a coat rack, or a stray shadow cast by a piece of furniture, or simply the overactive imagination of a tired 11-year-old who should have been asleep hours earlier instead of hunched over a drawing album in the middle of the night. I understand why they say that. I've tried to convince myself of the exact same thing more times than I could possibly count, running through every rational explanation I can think of, testing each one against the memory to see if it finally fits well enough to let the whole thing go. But none of those explanations ever quite hold up under close enough examination. At least not for me. A coat or a stray piece of furniture doesn't hold a shape quite so specifically the size and proportion of a small child. Shadows, no matter how oddly cast, don't typically come paired with a completely separate, distinctly colored object sitting right alongside them, something as vivid and specific as that long red bag. A detail my mind has never managed to explain away, no matter how many times I've turned it over. And more than anything else, shadows and stray objects don't produce that same instinctive, bone-deep certainty that something is watching you. A feeling that is never fully faded from that memory, no matter how many years have passed since that night. What strikes me most now, looking back on it as an adult with all the benefit of hindsight and rational thinking that comes with age, is how completely ordinary the rest of that night was on either side of those few frightening minutes. Before I looked up and saw that shape standing in the corridor, I had simply been a bored, sleepy kid, doodling in an album, enjoying a bit of quiet, illicit freedom before bedtime. And after my mother came in and scolded me, sending me off to sleep the way any tired parent would with a stubborn child, the rest of the night passed without a single further incident. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place, just an ordinary night's sleep, following right on the heels of the strangest few minutes of my entire childhood. That contrast, more than anything else about the memory itself, is what makes it so difficult to simply file away as an overactive imagination or a trick of tired eyes. If it had happened during some larger, more dramatic night, surrounded by other strange occurrences, other odd sounds or disturbances throughout the house, I think I could believe more easily that my mind had simply worked itself up into some kind of frightened state that produced an imagined figure out of nothing. But it wasn't like that at all. It was an entirely unremarkable night, right up until the single moment I looked up from my drawing and found something standing in my doorway that had absolutely no business being there. And then, just as suddenly, an entirely unremarkable night again, the moment my mother's footsteps chased whatever it was away. I never told my parents the full truth about what happened that night. Not then, and honestly, not even now as an adult looking back on it with them from a distance of many years. Some memories, I think, are simply meant to stay exactly where they happened. Tucked away in that one particular corridor of that one particular house, never fully explained, never fully resolved, existing only as a single, vivid, unshakable memory of the moment an 11-year-old girl looked up from her drawing and found herself staring at something the rest of the world will probably never be able to explain to her satisfaction. We moved out of that house a few years later, for reasons that had nothing to do with that night at all. Just ordinary family circumstances that eventually take every child away from their childhood home sooner or later. I've driven past the old street a handful of times since then, mostly out of nostalgia, glancing toward the house as we passed, and every single time, without fail, my eyes drift toward the side of the building where I know that long, dark corridor still runs, hidden now behind new curtains and a different family's belongings. I've never worked up the nerve to ask whoever lives there now whether they've noticed anything unusual about that particular stretch of hallway, whether anything small and still has ever stood there, waiting in the dark for them the way it once waited for me. Part of me doesn't want to know. Part of me has simply learned, over the years, to let that one night exist entirely on its own, separate from everything else. A single, unexplained thread left dangling at the edge of an otherwise perfectly ordinary childhood. I had recently started working for a small carpentry business, fresh out of high school, still figuring out the basics of a job I genuinely knew almost nothing about beforehand. Everything about the work was still new to me back then. The tools, the terminology, the routines, the small unspoken rules that everyone else on the crew already understood without needing to be told. I was the kind of new hire who was still nodding along a beat too late in conversations, still double-checking myself before doing even the simplest tasks, just trying to prove I could keep up and be useful despite having almost no real experience going in. One early morning, not long after I'd started, my boss called me directly and asked me to make my way over to one of the job sites we had going at the time. It wasn't unusual for him to send individual crew members out ahead of the rest of the team, especially given how thin we were stretched at that point. There were only 6 of us on the entire crew, which meant we were almost always understaffed for whatever job we had lined up, bouncing between sites and juggling whatever needed doing with far fewer hands than the work probably called for. I got myself over to the address he'd given me and arrived at the house not long after. It was a private residence, one of the many jobs we were working through at the time, and when I walked up, my boss was already there, waiting. He walked me through what needed to be done that day, pointing out specific tasks, explaining where the materials and equipment were set up inside, giving me the kind of quick, practical rundown you give someone still learning the ropes. Once he was satisfied I understood what I was meant to be doing, he headed off to deal with something else, leaving me there on my own to get started. Being brand new to the job, and to this specific site, I was on edge in the way any new employee is when left alone somewhere unfamiliar for the first time, but nothing about the morning felt particularly unusual at that point. Just an ordinary job site, an ordinary quiet house, and an ordinary list of tasks waiting for me to get through them. I was the only person at that house that morning, entirely alone, given how understaffed we were and how spread out our crew tended to be across different sites depending on the day. After my boss left, I took my shoes off at the door out of habit and respect for the homeowner's floors. The kind of small courtesy you learn quickly in this line of work even before anyone explicitly tells you to do it, and made my way toward the basement stairs where most of our equipment and materials had been set up for this particular job. As I started down the steps, I heard something that sounded distinctly like panting, coming from somewhere down in the basement below me. My first instinct, reasonable enough given the circumstances, was that the family living in the house probably had a dog somewhere down there, maybe shut away in a room while workers were in and out of the house, panting the way dogs do when they're excited or a little anxious about strange footsteps moving around nearby. It didn't strike me as odd enough to stop what I was doing, so I just continued down the stairs toward the unfinished room where our supplies were kept. I made my way into that unfinished basement room, the one holding all our equipment for the job. Buckets of drywall mud, tools, various bits of material scattered around in the organized chaos that construction sites always seem to have. I got straight to work, starting to clean out some of the mud buckets that needed attention before I could get on with the rest of the tasks my boss had laid out for me. It was mundane, repetitive work, the kind that lets your mind wander a little while your hands stay busy. And for a few minutes, everything felt completely normal. Then I heard a bark. It wasn't an ordinary bark, though, not the kind you'd expect from an actual dog somewhere in the house. It had a strange, distorted quality to it, something that immediately struck me as sounding less like a real animal and more like a grown man attempting to imitate the sound of a dog barking, some exaggerated, almost theatrical version of what a bark should sound like, off in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on, but that registered immediately as wrong. My first thought, trying to make sense of something that unsettling in the most rational way possible, was that it must be my boss, that he'd come back for something he forgot and was trying to mess with me. maybe hoping to get a laugh out of scaring the new guy on his first solo assignment at this particular site. Holding on to that explanation, because it was the only one that made any sense at the time, I set down what I was working on and walked over to the doorway of the room, calling out his name loudly enough that it would carry through the basement if he really was somewhere nearby, waiting to see if I'd take the bait. There was no reply, nothing but silence answering back at me from the rest of the basement. That silence unsettled me more than I expected it to. I started feeling genuinely uneasy at that point, the kind of creeping discomfort that makes the back of your neck prickle even before your rational mind fully catches up to what your instincts are already telling you. I decided it would be best to head back upstairs, to get out of that basement and put some distance between myself and whatever had made that sound, reasoning that I could always come back down to finish the work once my boss returned, or once I'd shaken off whatever nervous energy had built up in me over the last few minutes. But before I could even make it out of that room, I heard the same barking noise again, closer this time, coming unmistakably from somewhere else, down in that same basement. Against every instinct telling me to just leave, some combination of curiosity and a stubborn refusal to let my imagination get the better of me on only my first few weeks at this job pushed me to go check one of the other rooms down there, to actually find the source of whatever was making that unsettling sound, rather than just fleeing without understanding what I'd actually heard. I made my way toward one of the adjoining rooms in that basement, and when I finally saw what was making that noise, every ounce of unease I'd been feeling exploded into something much closer to real, overwhelming fear. There was a dog there, or at least something that resembled a dog in its basic shape and size. It was enormous, far larger than any dog I'd ever encountered in a normal household, its body filling far more space than felt natural for whatever breed I was supposedly looking at. But it was the eyes that truly unsettled me, more than the size, more than anything else about its physical presence in that dim, unfinished room. There was something deeply wrong about the way those eyes looked, something uncanny in a way that's genuinely difficult to put into words even now, looking back on it. They didn't carry the ordinary, simple awareness you'd expect from a dog's gaze that familiar warmth or curiosity or alertness animals typically have. Instead, there was something far more knowing behind them, something that felt disturbingly aware in a way no ordinary animal's eyes have any business being. The overall impression that hit me, standing there frozen in that doorway, staring at this impossibly large dog with its deeply wrong-looking eyes, was that it looked almost like a grown man had somehow found a way to hide himself inside the skin of a dog, wearing it the way you'd wear an ill-fitting costume, something moving and existing inside that canine shape that had absolutely no business being contained within it. I can't fully explain what gave me that specific, overwhelming impression, only that it hit me instantly and completely, an instinctive, bone-deep certainty that whatever I was looking at wasn't simply an unusually large or strange-looking dog, but something else entirely. Something wearing that shape the way you'd wear a disguise, poorly, imperfectly, with something unmistakably human still lingering somewhere behind those unsettling eyes. My whole body reacted before my mind had even fully processed what I was looking at. My eyes started watering up almost immediately, an involuntary reaction to pure, visceral fear rather than anything to do with dust or irritation in that basement air. Chills ran across every inch of my skin, the kind of full-body shiver that leaves you feeling cold from the inside out, regardless of the actual temperature around you. I don't remember consciously deciding to move, but somehow I found myself backing away from that room, my legs carrying me faster and faster until I was practically running for the stairs, desperate to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever that thing actually was. I don't remember much about the exact sequence of getting back up those basement stairs and out of that house. Only that by the time I was standing outside again, my hands were shaking and my heart was pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. I sat in my car for a long while after that, trying to steady myself before I even attempted to call my boss, trying to figure out how I was even supposed to explain what had just happened without sounding like I'd completely lost my mind on only my first few weeks at this job. When my boss finally did answer, I told him as calmly as I could manage that something was wrong at the site, that I needed him to come back, though I remember deliberately holding back most of the actual details at first, worried that describing exactly what I'd seen would make me sound unstable or unreliable this early into a new job. He must have heard something in my voice, though, some genuine edge of panic I couldn't fully disguise, because he agreed to head back without much argument, telling me to just wait for him outside rather than going back into the house alone. By the time he arrived, I'd calmed down just enough to give him a somewhat more coherent account of what had happened. The panting, the strange bark, the enormous dog with those deeply wrong eyes waiting in that basement room. He didn't dismiss it outright, which surprised me a little given how absurd the whole thing sounded even as I was describing it myself. Instead, he went inside to check the basement himself, insisting I stay outside while he did, and came back out a few minutes later saying there was nothing down there at all. No dog, no sign that any animal had ever been in that basement to begin with. That should have been reassuring, in theory. An empty basement, nothing unusual found, a rational explanation waiting somewhere just out of reach if I only looked hard enough for it. But it wasn't reassuring at all. If anything, it made the whole experience feel even more unsettling, because it meant that whatever I had seen down there, whatever had made those sounds and stared back at me with those impossibly wrong eyes, had simply vanished without a trace in the short amount of time it took me to run upstairs and call for help. We never did get a straight answer about what exactly had been down in that basement that morning. The homeowners, when eventually asked, in the most careful, roundabout way my boss could manage without sounding completely ridiculous himself, insisted they didn't own any pets at all and had never kept any animals in that house during the time they'd lived there. That answer only deepened the unease that whole experience left behind, confirming that whatever I'd encountered that morning had no ordinary explanation, waiting to neatly resolve it. I finished out the rest of that job eventually, though never again alone, and never again without a persistent, low-grade unease settling over me every single time I had to head down into that particular basement for the remainder of the work being done in that house. My boss, to his credit, never made me go down there by myself again for the rest of that project, though he never said much more about it either, the way people sometimes avoid discussing things they genuinely can't explain, preferring instead to just quietly work around them. I've thought about that morning more times than I'd like to admit in the years since, turning it over in my mind, searching for some rational explanation that might finally let me set it aside entirely the way you're supposed to be able to do with strange, unexplained moments once enough time has passed. I've tried convincing myself it must have been some trick of exhaustion or nerves, an inexperienced new hire's imagination running wild in an unfamiliar, empty house on one of his very first solo assignments. But none of those explanations have ever fully managed to explain away the specific visceral wrongness of those eyes, the unmistakable sense that something far too aware, far too knowing, was staring back at me from inside a shape that had no business holding whatever was actually looking out through it. Even now, working in this same industry, walking into unfamiliar basements and empty houses on a regular basis as simply part of the job. Some small, stubborn part of me still tenses every single time I hear an unexpected sound coming from somewhere below me in an otherwise quiet house. My mind instinctively bracing itself for the possibility of hearing that same unnatural, distorted bark rising up out of the dark, and finding, once again, something wearing a shape it was never truly meant to wear. Looking back, I think what disturbs me most about the whole experience isn't even the size of that dog, or the sound it made, or the way its presence seemed to swallow up that entire basement room the moment I laid eyes on it. It's the eyes themselves that still visit me sometimes, late at night, when my mind wanders somewhere it shouldn't. There was a stillness to them that no living animal ever really has. A patience that felt deliberate rather than instinctive, like whatever was behind them wasn't simply reacting to my presence the way a startled or curious animal naturally would, but was instead watching me the entire time, fully aware, fully present, waiting to see what I would do next before deciding on some response of its own. I've asked a few of the older guys on the crew carefully, without giving away too much detail, whether they'd ever experienced anything strange on a job site before, hoping maybe I'd stumble across someone else who'd had a similar encounter, something that might help me make sense of my own. Most of them just laughed it off, telling the usual stories construction workers tell about creaky old houses and overactive imaginations on long, exhausting days. But one of the older carpenters, a guy who'd been doing this work for the better part of 20 years, went quiet for a moment when I brought it up, then admitted, almost reluctantly, that older houses sometimes hold on to things nobody can fully explain, and that the best thing to do, in his experience, was simply not to go looking for answers you might not actually want once you found them. That advice has stuck with me more than almost anything else from that entire job. I don't know what was really down in that basement that morning, and at this point, years later, I don't think I ever will. All I know for certain is what I saw, what I heard, and the way my entire body reacted before my conscious mind had even finished processing what was standing in front of me. Whatever that thing actually was, wearing that oversized, unnatural shape, staring back at me with eyes that held far too much awareness behind them, I've never forgotten it. And some, quiet, careful part of me hopes I never have to see anything like it again for as long as I continue doing this kind of work. We finished that particular house months ago now. The family moved in not long after, and as far as I know, life there has gone on completely normally ever since. No further reports of anything strange. No complaints about odd sounds or sightings from anyone living there now. Sometimes I wonder if whatever I encountered that morning was simply passing through, drawn briefly to an empty house full of unfamiliar noise and activity before moving on to wherever it came from in the first place. Other times, I wonder if it's still down there somewhere, quiet and patient, waiting for another unsuspecting new hire to wander down those basement stairs alone on an early morning, following the same sound of panting in the dark that I once mistook for nothing more than somebody's pet. Either way, I know one thing for certain now, something I never really understood before that job. Not every strange sound in an old house deserves to be investigated, and not every uneasy feeling is worth pushing past just to satisfy your own curiosity. Because some doors, once you look behind them, can never quite be closed again in your mind. When I was 10 years old, my grandpa and I were driving out to a ranch in Mexico late one night. The kind of long, quiet drive that only really happens in the deep hours of early morning when the rest of the world is asleep and the road belongs entirely to whoever's brave enough or foolish enough to still be out on it. It was around 3:40 in the morning, and we were making our way down a stretch of road that, according to more than a few locals, carried a reputation for being haunted, a road people generally preferred not to drive down alone, especially not at that particular hour of the night. My grandpa had this old blue Ford pickup truck that he loved dearly, the kind of vehicle that had clearly seen years of hard use out on ranch roads and back country routes just like this one, its paint a little faded, its engine rumbling with that familiar, comforting sound of something built solid and dependable. I always felt safe riding in that truck with him, no matter where we were headed, because being with my grandpa on those long drives always felt like the safest place in the world to me at that age. We were just making easy conversation the way we always did on those late-night drives, talking about nothing in particular. The kind of comfortable, meandering chat that fills up long stretches of empty highway when there's nothing else around to look at except darkness and the occasional flash of scrub brush caught briefly in the headlights. At some point in that conversation, almost casually, my grandpa mentioned the reputation of the road we were on. He told me in that same easy conversational tone he'd been using the whole drive that this particular road was supposed to be haunted, that people said a woman would sometimes appear standing on the side of the road asking for rides from whoever happened to be driving by. As soon as he said that, a cold, prickling kind of fear settled into my stomach, the specific kind of fear only a 10-year-old can feel when an adult they trust completely casually mentions something genuinely terrifying in the middle of an otherwise normal conversation. I immediately turned to look out my window, half out of morbid curiosity and half because some instinctive part of me needed to check, needed to make sure there wasn't actually a woman standing out there on the shoulder of the road, waiting in the dark exactly the way my grandpa had just described. For a while after that, nothing happened. The story hung there in the cab of the truck, unsettling but distant. The kind of thing that scares you for a few minutes before the ordinary rhythm of the drive gradually eases you back into feeling safe again. We kept talking, or at least tried to, though I noticed my own attention kept drifting back toward the window every so often, scanning the dark edges of the road just in case. About 40 minutes passed like that, the two of us continuing on down that same long stretch of haunted road, the sun still nowhere close to rising. The sky outside still that deep, featureless black that swallows up everything beyond the reach of the headlights. At some point during that stretch, I started to notice something different about my grandpa's behavior. He kept glancing up at his rearview mirror, again and again, far more often than felt normal for someone just checking behind them out of habit while driving. I asked him what was wrong, genuinely curious why he kept looking back like that, worried maybe another car was following too closely or something wasn't right with the truck itself. He answered simply, nothing, his voice carrying a strange, careful flatness to it that didn't quite match the casual tone he'd been using earlier in our conversation. I remember that flatness bothering me more than an actual admission of fear might have, because it felt like he was deliberately holding something back, choosing his words carefully instead of just answering naturally the way he normally would. Something about the way he said it and the way his eyes kept flicking back up toward that mirror made me turn and look at it myself. The second I did, my heart dropped straight through my chest, and my entire body went rigid with a fear so complete and so paralyzing that I couldn't have moved even if I'd wanted to. There, reflected clearly in the rearview mirror, sitting in the back of our truck, was a woman in a long white dress, her presence utterly still, utterly silent, and her eyes, when I finally forced myself to focus on them, were completely black, pitch black from edge to edge, with no visible whites at all, nothing human or warm about them whatsoever. I couldn't speak. I couldn't scream. I couldn't even manage to turn my head away from that mirror my whole body locked in place by a fear so total that it felt like every muscle I had simply refused to respond to anything my mind was screaming at it to do. All I could do was sit there, frozen, staring at that reflection, at that impossible woman sitting silently in the bed of our truck, her black eyes seeming to stare back at me through the glass with an intensity that felt like it was pressing directly against my skin. My grandpa glanced up at the mirror again, and from the way his whole body suddenly went tense beside me, gripping the steering wheel tighter, his jaw clenching hard, I understood immediately that he was seeing exactly the same thing I was seeing. There was no mistaking it. No room left for me to wonder whether I'd imagined it or misread some trick of shadow and reflected headlights. He saw her too, at the exact same moment I did, and the reaction on his face confirmed everything I already knew in that instant. Without a word of warning, he slammed on the brakes as hard as he possibly could. The truck lurched violently, tires screeching against the road, my whole body thrown forward hard against my seatbelt as the vehicle skidded to an abrupt, shuddering stop. For a moment, neither of us said anything at all. We just turned and looked at each other, both of us breathing hard, both of us clearly shaken to our core by what we'd just witnessed together in that mirror. Then, almost in unison, we both turned back to check the mirrors again, needing to know, needing some kind of confirmation of what we'd just seen. She was gone. Completely gone, without a trace, the bed of the truck sitting empty behind us, exactly the way it should have been the entire time. No sign at all that anyone or anything had ever been sitting back there. My grandpa and I sat there in that stopped truck for a long moment, catching our breath, hearts still pounding, before either of us said anything more. When we finally did speak, it was to confirm out loud, carefully, deliberately, exactly what each of us had seen, needing to hear the other person say it just as much as we needed to say it ourselves. He asked me directly what I'd seen in that mirror, and I told him. A woman in a white dress, black eyes, sitting right there in the back of the truck. He nodded slowly, telling me that was exactly what he'd seen too, word for word, detail for detail, nothing different between our two accounts at all. That confirmation, strange as it sounds, was almost more unsettling than the sighting itself had been. If it had only been me who'd seen her, I think some part of me could have eventually convinced myself it was just a tired kid's imagination running wild in the middle of a long, dark drive after hearing a scary story. But my grandpa had seen the exact same thing, independently, at the exact same moment, with no prompting from me at all beyond his own glances up at that mirror before I'd even said a word about what I was seeing. We got out of the truck after that, still shaken, needing to physically move, to stretch our legs, to put some distance between ourselves and whatever had just happened inside that cab. And it was only once we were standing outside on the road, looking around properly in the dim early morning darkness, that we realized just how close we had actually come to a completely different kind of disaster entirely. The truck had come to a stop only a few feet away from the edge of a deep ditch running alongside that stretch of road, a drop steep and significant enough that driving into it at any real speed could easily have flipped the truck, could easily have gotten one or both of us seriously hurt, or worse. If my grandpa hadn't slammed on those brakes exactly when he did, reacting instinctively to whatever he'd seen in that mirror, we would have kept driving straight down that same stretch of road in the dark, completely unaware of that ditch waiting just ahead of us until it was far too late to do anything about it. Standing there on the side of that road in the dark, staring down into that ditch we'd come so close to driving straight into, the full weight of what had just happened settled over both of us at once. Whatever that woman in the mirror actually was, however she had appeared and then vanished so completely from the back of our truck, her sudden, terrifying appearance had caused my grandpa to slam on the brakes at exactly the one moment that mattered most, stopping us just short of a drop that could easily have killed us both. We didn't talk much more about it that night, beyond confirming what we'd both seen. We got back in the truck eventually, my grandpa driving noticeably slower and more carefully for the rest of that stretch, both of us glancing instinctively toward the mirrors every so often despite ourselves, half expecting, half dreading the possibility of seeing her there again. We made it to the ranch without any further incident, and life continued on from there much as it always had, except for one thing that never changed again after that night. We never took that road again, not once, not for any reason, no matter how much shorter or more convenient it might have been compared to whatever longer route we ended up taking instead. To this day, that remains the single scariest moment of my entire life. And even now, years later, I can still picture every detail of that mirror with perfect, unsettling clarity. The white dress, the utter stillness, those completely black eyes staring back at me from somewhere they had absolutely no business being. My grandpa and I have talked about that night more than a few times since then, always ending the conversation the same way, agreeing that whatever we saw that night, whoever or whatever she was standing on the back of that truck bed, she was real. We both saw her, and in some strange, impossible way, her sudden appearance in that mirror is very likely the exact reason both of us are still alive today to tell the story at all. My grandpa has since told me a little more about the reputation of that road, details he hadn't mentioned that first night, either because he hadn't wanted to frighten me further at the time, or because they simply hadn't crossed his mind until after everything we'd just gone through together. He said people in the area had been telling stories about that woman for as long as he could remember, long before I was even born, always describing her the same way. A figure in white standing along the roadside, sometimes flagging down cars as if asking for a ride, other times simply appearing without warning inside vehicles that were already moving, the way she'd appeared to us that night in the back of his truck. He told me some locals believed she died somewhere along that stretch of road decades earlier, in circumstances nobody could quite agree on, and that ever since she'd remained there, tied to that same dangerous curve, appearing every so often to travelers passing through in the dead of night. Whether any of that is actually true, I have no way of knowing for certain. And my grandpa always admitted as much himself, saying that stories like that tend to grow and shift a little more every time they're passed from one person to the next, picking up new details along the way that may or may not have any real basis in fact. But knowing the general shape of the story, even secondhand and uncertain as it is, has never made me any less certain about what I personally saw that night in that mirror. And it's never once made me want to test that road again, just to see whether the story holds any truth to it, after all. My grandpa passed away a few years after that night, and in the time since, that memory has only grown more important to me, not just as the scariest moment of my life, but as one of the last vivid memories I have of a night spent alone with him, just the two of us in that old blue truck, sharing something neither of us will ever fully be able to explain. Whenever I think back on him now, that night is almost always one of the first memories that surfaces. The two of us sitting frozen in that cab, staring at each other in stunned silence after slamming to a stop just short of that ditch. Both of us equally certain of what we'd just seen, both of us equally grateful, in a strange, quiet way, that whatever had appeared in that mirror had chosen that exact moment to show itself. I've told this story to a handful of people over the years, cousins, close friends, A few coworkers who ended up trading their own strange stories in return once I'd finished telling mine. Almost everyone reacts the same way at first, offering some gentle, rational explanation, suggesting it must have been exhaustion, or a trick of the headlights reflecting off dust on the back window, or simply two tired travelers letting a scary story get the better of their imaginations in the middle of a long, dark drive. I understand why people reach for those explanations. I've reached for them myself plenty of times over the years, testing them against the memory to see if any of them finally fit well enough to let the whole thing settle into something ordinary and explainable. But none of them ever hold up completely, not once I really sit with the details. Dust on a window doesn't take the shape of a woman in a full-length white dress. Tired eyes playing tricks in the dark don't typically produce the exact same image, down to the smallest detail, in two separate people's minds at the exact same instant. Especially not two people who hadn't exchanged a single word about what they were seeing before confirming it out loud to each other afterward. And, more than anything else, exhaustion and imagination don't usually save your life by causing you to slam on the brakes at precisely the one moment that mattered most, stopping you just short of a ditch you hadn't even known was there. That's the part of the story that stays with me most now, more than the fear itself, more than the black eyes or the pale dress or the impossible way she simply vanished the moment we both looked back to check. Whatever she was, wherever she came from, however she managed to appear and disappear from the back of a moving truck on a dark stretch of road in the middle of the night, her sudden, terrifying presence in that mirror gave my grandpa exactly the fraction of a second he needed to react, to slam his foot down on the brake before either of us even understood why. And in doing so, she very likely saved both our lives that night, whether that had been her intention or not. I still drive out to visit family in that same part of Mexico from time to time. And every single time, without fail, I make a point of avoiding that particular stretch of road entirely, choosing a longer route without a second thought, even when the detour costs me extra time I don't really have to spare. Some roads, I've come to believe, are better left avoided altogether, no matter how much shorter the drive might be, no matter how many years have passed since the night you first learned exactly why people warned you to stay away from them in the first place. I've since told my own kids the same warning my grandpa gave me that night, describing that same road, that same woman in white with her pitch-black eyes, hoping they'll take it seriously the way I eventually learned to, and hoping, more than anything, that none of them will ever have to see for themselves exactly why that warning matters so much, or feel the same cold, paralyzing fear that gripped me that morning as a 10-year-old boy staring into a rearview mirror he never expected to hold. Anything but his own reflection, and the reflection of the grandfather sitting quietly beside him, driving them both safely home through the dark, the truck's old engine rumbling steady and familiar beneath them all the way back. My family has a tradition of traveling to Mexico once every 2 years during our summer break, always making sure to spend that time visiting relatives, catching up on everything we'd missed since the last visit. A couple of years back, when I was about 10 years old, we made that same trip again, staying, as we always did, at my grandma's house. Her house was fairly large, spread out across a decent amount of land, but it had one particular design feature that always felt strange to me compared to the houses I was used to back home. Most of the property had no roof over it at all, left completely open to the sky, because my grandma had always loved letting the sunlight pour freely through her home during the day. Only certain rooms, the bedrooms, the bathroom, a small storage space, had actual roofs built over them, while the rest of the house stood open, walled but uncovered, letting the sun and open air move through freely wherever there wasn't a proper ceiling to block it. One night during that particular visit, I woke up suddenly to the sound of barking, mixed with loud, heavy banging, a combination jarring enough to snap me straight out of sleep. I looked around the room I shared with my sisters, searching the darkness for anything that might explain the noise, but there was nothing there. Nothing at all out of place inside that room. I tried closing my eyes again, hoping to drift back off despite everything, but the noise outside was simply too loud and too insistent to ignore. Lying there in the dark, I found myself wondering whether I was the only one who could even hear it, whether the rest of my family had somehow slept straight through something that loud, or whether I was simply more sensitive to noise than everyone else in the house. The kind of light sleeper who wakes at sounds that leave everyone else completely undisturbed. Eventually, curiosity won out over fear, and I got up, stepping outside my room to investigate further. It didn't take long to trace the source. My bedroom sat only a few feet from the front door, close enough that all I had to do was turn right out of the doorway, and I was standing right in front of it. That's exactly what I did, walking toward the noise until I was standing directly at that door. Listening, I didn't open it. Something held me back from actually doing that, and instead I just stood there for a while, listening carefully to whatever was happening on the other side. There was a small window built into the door itself, positioned too high for me to reach at that age, and I remember wishing more than once that night that I could have found some way to see through it. Maybe by dragging over a chair to stand on, anything that might have let me actually see what was out there, instead of just listening blindly in the dark. When the noise grew louder still, I finally gave in and went to wake up my mom, hoping she could explain it, or at least calm my nerves enough to let me sleep. Still mostly asleep herself, she mumbled that it was probably just a dog outside and told me to go back to bed. Some part of me wanted to accept that explanation, but it never quite sat right, even at 10 years old. Maybe the barking fit well enough with the idea of a dog outside, but the banging didn't fit at all. It was loud, hard, and sharp, almost metallic in how it struck against the door. Nothing at all like the sound any ordinary dog could realistically produce, no matter how big or agitated it happened to be. Not long after, I needed to use the bathroom, so despite everything, I made my way there through the dark house. Once inside, I ended up staying far longer than necessary, too nervous to head back out and cross that same stretch of house alone while the noise was still going on somewhere nearby. I stayed in there for what felt like a long stretch of time, probably around 4 extra minutes, before finally working up the nerve to open the door and make a run for my room. I took a steadying breath, and right as I did, I heard a loud bang, or whatever sound something makes when it suddenly falls and strikes the ground. Something had just fallen right outside the bathroom door, close enough that the sound made me flinch violently. Panic shot through me, and I immediately looked out through the one small window I could actually reach from inside that bathroom, desperate to catch sight of whatever had caused the noise. All I saw was a small pot lying knocked over outside. "That's weird," I whispered to myself, staring at it, trying to make sense of how it had ended up like that. My grandparents were both incredibly heavy sleepers, and honestly, so was the rest of my family. Everyone except me. I always seemed to be the one most easily woken by sound, the lightest sleeper among all of them by a wide margin. My grandparents' bedroom sat far from the bathroom, much too far for either of them to have caused that pot to topple over. The only room actually close enough to make any sense as a possible source was one that had been abandoned entirely, converted into nothing more than a storage space, with absolutely nobody sleeping inside it that night, or any other night. My grandparents used to keep a dog years earlier, but hadn't owned one since it passed away, supposedly from a snake bite, sometime before I was old enough to really remember him clearly. Standing there in that dark hallway, I found myself wishing I'd been present for his final moments, an oddly disconnected thought considering the fear gripping me in that exact instant, my mind grasping for something familiar amid all the confusion. None of it made any logical sense to me at all. I stood there running through every possible explanation I could think of, and nothing fit together properly. Nothing accounted for who or what could have knocked that pot over so close to a bathroom. Nobody but me was anywhere near that night. Eventually, I decided there was nothing left to do but run for it, sprinting from the bathroom straight back toward my shared bedroom as fast as my legs could carry me. There were a couple of stairs along the way, and I very nearly tripped and fell going down them in my rush, heart pounding hard the entire time. I refused to look back over my shoulder as I ran, too afraid of what I might see if I did. Though I did hear something trailing along behind me regardless, some sound I couldn't quite place carried through the dark. I kept my eyes forward until I made it safely back inside my room. The moment I got back inside, the barking and banging started up all over again, just as loud and just as insistent as before. Lying there in the dark, listening to it continue, my mind raced through every possible explanation, wondering if someone outside was slamming a dog against the door out of cruelty, or if someone with a dog was simply trying, forcefully and repeatedly, to force their way inside. None of the explanations I came up with felt entirely right, but none of them felt completely wrong either. Just uneasy possibilities drifting through my exhausted mind as I lay there, barely sleeping at all for the rest of that night. The following night, the exact same sounds returned, the barking and banging picking right back up as though nothing had changed since the night before. This time, desperate to block it all out, and finally get some proper sleep. I managed to dig up a pair of headphones belonging to one of my sisters. I put them on, played some music quietly, and let it carry me off to sleep, despite whatever was still happening somewhere out there beyond my door. The day after that, I woke up feeling genuinely unwell, sick enough that the adults decided I needed medical attention right away. The only thing that ended up curing whatever had taken hold of me was a shot, some kind of vaccine given to help me recover fully. It took a little while after that before I finally had enough strength back in me to move around properly again. Once I was finally well enough to be up and walking normally, I found myself standing near the front door at some point, glancing outside toward the street where a handful of houses sat across from my grandma's place, houses that occasionally had dogs wandering past throughout the day. But it was the door itself that caught my full attention that particular morning. Carved deep into its surface were scratches, a kind of marks that looked distinctly like claws, similar in shape to what a cat might leave behind, except far larger, big enough to suggest something significantly bigger than any ordinary house cat had made them. I stood there, staring at those scratches, trying to piece together what could possibly have left marks that size, until my eyes drifted down and landed on something else entirely. There, lower on the door, was a dent, a deep, unmistakable impression pressed straight into the solid wood. Something had struck that door with enough repeated force to actually dent it, and standing there, staring at the evidence in broad daylight, every bit of fear from those 2 sleepless nights came flooding straight back. I got scared all over again, right there in front of that damaged door, and quickly turned and hurried off toward wherever I needed to be that day, which happened to be the local store to help pick up some groceries. I remember practically running the whole way there, grateful for any excuse to put distance between myself and that door and whatever had left those marks behind on it. Even now, whenever I think back on that visit, or whenever I happen to pass a door that reminds me even slightly of that one, I find myself asking the exact same question I asked myself, standing there that morning, staring at those deep claw marks and that unmistakable dent pressed into solid wood. Who, or what, was actually outside that door those 2 nights, banging and clawing and barking with enough force to dent wood and leave scratches far too large for any ordinary animal to have made? I never got an answer, not during that trip, and not during any of the family visits that followed in the years since, and at this point, I don't think I ever will. Looking back on it now as an adult, I've run through every rational explanation I can think of, trying to finally put the whole memory to rest once and for all. A stray dog, perhaps an unusually large or aggressive one, could maybe explain the barking, and possibly some of the banging, too, if it threw itself repeatedly against the door in some kind of agitated frenzy. But dogs simply don't leave claw marks that size, deep and wide enough to suggest something far larger and stronger than anything I've ever personally encountered. And no dog, regardless of size or determination, manages to dent solid wood through sheer repeated impact alone without leaving other, more obvious signs of injury or exhaustion behind as well. I've also wondered more than once whether the timing of my sudden illness right after those 2 disturbed nights meant anything significant at all. Whether it was simply coincidence, ordinary stress and exhaustion catching up with a frightened 10-year-old, or whether it was somehow connected to whatever had been outside that door. I've never found a satisfying answer to that question either. Only the uncomfortable coincidence of it sitting there in my memory alongside everything else from that particular visit. My family has kept making that same trip to Mexico every 2 years since then, just like always, and my grandma's house remains exactly the way it's always been, open to the sky in most places, sunlight pouring freely through most of the property throughout the day. But every single time I walk past that same front door now, whether during daylight or after dark, some small, stubborn part of me still glances at it a little longer than I probably need to, still remembers those 2 sleepless nights and the marks left behind on that solid wooden surface, and still finds myself asking the exact same question that has never once found a proper answer. Who, or what, was actually standing outside that door? I've asked my grandma about it a few times over the years, gently, careful not to make it sound too dramatic or worry her unnecessarily. She's always brushed it off the same way my mom did that first night, insisting it was probably just some large stray dog wandering over from one of the neighboring houses. She's never seemed particularly bothered by the scratches or the dent, treating them as just another small bit of wear an old house naturally picks up over the years. I've often wondered whether she genuinely believes that, or whether she's simply lived in that house long enough to have made peace with things she can't fully explain, choosing not to dwell on them the way some part of me still can't help but do. I've also brought it up with my sisters a handful of times since that trip, curious whether either of them remembered hearing anything at all that night while we were all sharing that same small room together. Neither of them recalls waking up to any noise, either that first night or the one after. Both of them sleeping straight through it exactly the way the rest of the family apparently did. That has always struck me as strange, given how close together we were sleeping, and given just how loud and relentless those sounds had felt to me at the time. I've never been able to decide whether that simply means I was more sensitive to sound than the rest of my family, or whether there was something else at work that night. Something that, for whatever reason, only I happened to notice. There's also the abandoned storage room to consider, the one closest to the bathroom, the one nobody had slept in for years by the time we visited. I've never asked exactly what used to be kept in there, or how long it had actually sat empty before that trip, or whether anything unusual had ever happened in or around it before my family started noticing strange things during our visits. Part of me suspects that room might hold some small piece of the answer I've never quite managed to put together. Some detail nobody has ever bothered mentioning, simply because they never connected it to those two frightening nights the way I always have. And part of me, if I'm honest, has never really wanted to ask, worried that whatever answer I got would only make passing that door and that quiet, empty room beside it even harder than it already is. Whatever the actual truth turns out to be, I know we'll keep making that same trip to Mexico every 2 years, just like always, and I know that every single visit, at some point, I'll find myself glancing at that same front door, checking whether those old scratches and that dent are still visible, half expecting and half dreading the possibility of hearing that same barking and banging return. Again, someday, somewhere out there in the dark, on the other side of a door I still, even now, have never once worked up the courage to actually open. Sometimes, back home and far away from that house, lying awake in my own bed on an ordinary night, my mind still drifts back to that hallway, that small window I couldn't quite reach, that pot lying overturned in the dark. I think about how calm everyone else in the family seemed the next morning, how easily they accepted the explanation of a stray dog and moved on with the rest of the visit as though nothing unusual had happened at all. And I think about how I never really moved on the same way, how some quiet, unresolved piece of that night has stayed with me ever since, tucked away at the back of my mind, surfacing every single time I find myself standing near a closed door late at night, listening carefully for sounds I both hope and fear I might hear again, wondering if whatever left those marks on my grandma's front door is still out there somewhere, patient and unseen, waiting for another quiet night to make itself known again, the way it once did to a frightened 10-year-old boy who never got the chance to see what was actually standing on the other side, and who still, all these years later, has never quite worked up the nerve to find out, no matter how many summers have passed, and no matter how many more times he walks by that same old door on the way in and out of his grandma's house. Each time quietly hoping it stays as silent as it has for the last several visits, and each time bracing, just a little, in case it doesn't, in case the barking and banging start up again the moment the lights go out and the whole house finally settles into sleep around him, the way it did that one summer, years ago now, when he was just 10 years old and far too curious for his own good. My old house had something wrong with it. Something that never felt like ordinary creaks or drafts you could explain away easily the way people usually try to with an older home. There were bad spirits in that place, and over time, the evidence of it became too consistent, too repeated, for any of us to keep pretending it was nothing more than an old house settling or our imaginations running away with us. At some point, things had gotten strange enough that I started recording whenever we left the house, just leaving a camera or a phone running in an empty room before we walked out the door. I wasn't entirely sure what I expected to catch, if anything, but something told me it was worth trying, worth having some kind of record of what was happening in that house when nobody was supposed to be inside it. And when I played those recordings back later, there was always something there. Voices that didn't belong to any of us. And, more than once, the unmistakable sound of a guitar being played somewhere in the empty house, plucked out, note by note, as though someone was sitting there quietly practicing to themselves in a house that should have been completely still and silent. Nobody in my family played guitar. There wasn't even a guitar in that house at the time, no instrument anywhere that could have accounted for that sound showing up so clearly on the recordings. Hearing it the first time sent a chill straight through me. But hearing it again and again on separate recordings, spaced out over different days, made it impossible to write off as some fluke or trick of the recording equipment. Something was in that house, playing that guitar, while every single one of us was somewhere else entirely, nowhere near home. Things escalated slowly at first, and then not so slowly, until it eventually got so bad that we made the decision to stop sleeping in our actual bedrooms altogether, all of us gathering instead to sleep together in the living room, closer to each other, closer to the front door, as if proximity to each other and to an exit might offer some small measure of protection against whatever was sharing that house with us. Even that change didn't fully stop what was happening, though. One night, sleeping out there in the living room with the rest of my family nearby, I woke up suddenly to the sound of knocking, coming distinctly from the direction of a mirror somewhere nearby in the house. It wasn't a soft or ambiguous sound, nothing that could be mistaken for the house settling or some pipe ticking as it cooled. It was a deliberate, rhythmic knocking, exactly the kind of sound someone makes when they're rapping their knuckles against glass on purpose, trying to get someone's attention. I turned my head toward the sound, still half caught between sleep and full wakefulness, and that's when I saw it. Standing in the hallway, visible from where I lay, was a black figure, tall and solid-looking, its shape distinct enough against the darker shadows around it that there was no mistaking it for a trick of light or an oddly placed coat left hanging somewhere. It stood there in that hallway, unmoving, and every part of me went cold and rigid at the sight of it, my whole body locking up with the kind of primal fear that makes you forget, for a moment, how to even move or breathe properly. I don't know how long I lay there staring at that figure before I finally managed to look away, or how long it remained standing there in that hallway after I did. What I remember most clearly is the fear itself, the absolute certainty that whatever I was looking at did not belong in that house, did not belong anywhere near my family, and had no business standing there in our hallway in the middle of the night, knocking on mirrors and watching us sleep in a living room we'd retreated to specifically because our own bedrooms no longer felt safe. To make a long story a little shorter, after enough of these experiences piling up, one after another, I started keeping a Bible close to me at night, placing it right by my head whenever I lay down to sleep, praying regularly, asking for whatever protection I could find against whatever it was that had taken up residence alongside us in that house. I wasn't sure at the time whether it would actually make any difference, whether prayer and scripture kept physically close to me while I slept could really do anything against something that could knock on mirrors and play guitars nobody owned and stand silently in hallways watching us in the dark. But I didn't know what else to do, and it felt better, at the very least, to be doing something rather than simply lying there every night waiting helplessly for whatever might happen next. Then, one particular night, everything changed. I found myself in a state of sleep paralysis, that strange, terrifying place between sleep and waking where your mind is fully alert but your body refuses to respond, locked completely still no matter how hard you try to move. I'd experienced sleep paralysis before that night, and it had never been anything but frightening, the kind of experience that leaves you gasping the moment you finally break free of it, shaken and unsettled for hours afterward. But this time was different from every other episode I'd had before or since. In the middle of that paralysis, unable to move, unable to speak, I saw what looked unmistakably like Jesus standing there in my vision, his presence somehow both vivid and calm all at once, cutting straight through the fear that sleep paralysis usually brings with it. He smiled at me, gently, warmly, the kind of smile that seemed to carry genuine reassurance behind it. And he told me, in a voice that felt as real and present as anything I'd ever heard while fully awake, do not worry. Then, in that same vision, he moved, walking down to the bottom of my steps, the same steps that led from the upper part of the house down toward the living room where my family and I had been sleeping those past weeks and months out of fear. He stood there at the bottom of those steps and opened his arms wide, a gesture that felt deliberate and pointed, directed specifically at whatever else might be listening or watching in that house alongside us. And he said, clearly and firmly, "You do not belong here." I don't fully know how to explain what happened in the days that followed that vision, except to say that whatever had been in that house, the thing that knocked on mirrors and played that unexplained guitar and stood silently watching us from the hallway in the shape of that tall black figure, left. Not gradually, not slowly fading out over weeks the way you might expect if it had simply lost interest or moved on in its own time, but quickly, decisively, as though something had genuinely been ordered out and had no choice but to comply. The house has been fine ever since that night. No more knocking on the mirror, no more guitar music playing in empty rooms while we were away. No more black figures standing silently in the hallway, watching us sleep. We eventually moved back into our own bedrooms, no longer needing the strange, makeshift safety of huddling together in the living room the way we had during those worst months. Life in that house returned to something ordinary and peaceful, the kind of unremarkable calm you don't fully appreciate until you've lived through months without it. I still think back on that vision often, turning it over carefully in my mind, trying to understand exactly what I experienced that night and why it happened when it did, after everything else we'd already been through in that house. I've had sleep paralysis plenty of times since, both before and after that particular night, and none of those other episodes have ever come close to matching what happened during that one. Every other time it's been frightening in the ordinary way sleep paralysis tends to be, a sense of being trapped, of some vague, shapeless dread pressing down on me while I remain completely unable to move. But that one night was different in every possible way. Calm rather than terrifying, reassuring rather than dreadful, ending not in relief once I finally broke free of the paralysis, but in a lingering sense of peace that stayed with me long after I fully woke up. I've told a handful of people this story over the years, close family, a few trusted friends, and reactions have varied quite a bit depending on who I'm talking to. Some people take it completely at face value, accepting it exactly the way I experienced it myself, as a genuine moment of divine intervention, arriving at precisely the point when my family and I needed it most. Others offer more skeptical explanations, suggesting that sleep paralysis alone can produce incredibly vivid, deeply meaningful hallucinations, especially in someone already under significant stress and fear from months of unexplained activity happening around them, and that my mind may have simply manufactured exactly the kind of comforting, protective vision I most needed to see at that particular moment, in order to finally find some peace. I understand both perspectives, and I don't think I need everyone who hears this story to believe it exactly the way I do in order for it to mean what it means to me. What I know for certain, setting aside any debate about what exactly caused that vision or why it took the specific shape that it did, is the simple, undeniable timeline of what actually happened in that house. The activity had been building steadily worse for a long stretch of time before that night. Bad enough that my entire family had abandoned our own bedrooms in favor of sleeping together in the living room out of genuine fear. And then, following that one specific night, following that vision and the words spoken within it, everything stopped, cleanly and completely, and never returned again for as long as we continued living in that house. Whatever explanation anyone wants to apply to that sequence of events, the practical result remains exactly the same either way. My family got our house back. We stopped sleeping huddled together in the living room out of fear and returned to our own separate bedrooms, sleeping soundly through the night without disturbance for the first time in longer than I can properly remember by that point. The knocking stopped. The guitar playing stopped. That tall black figure never again appeared standing silently in our hallway, watching us from the dark the way it once had on that particular night, before everything changed. I keep that Bible close to me still, even now, years removed from that house and everything that happened inside it. It's become less about active fear at this point and more about habit, about gratitude. A quiet reminder of a night I don't fully understand, but have never once doubted the reality of. Not for a single moment since it happened. Whatever walked through that house alongside my family for those difficult months, whatever knocked on that mirror and played that guitar and stood watching us from the shadows of our own hallway, it was told plainly and directly that it did not belong there. And for reasons I may never fully understand on this side of things, it listened, and it left, and it never came back. Looking back now, I've spent a lot of time trying to piece together why that house, of all the houses my family has lived in over the years, ended up carrying whatever it was carrying in the first place. I never learned much about the property's history before we moved in. Nothing that stood out as an obvious explanation for why something would have attached itself to that specific place. I've wondered whether it had something to do with the land itself, or with whoever lived there before us, or whether it was simply drawn there for reasons that have nothing to do with the house at all, and everything to do with something else entirely. Something I'll probably never fully understand. What I do remember clearly, even now, is how those months of fear changed the rhythm of our entire household. We stopped leaving lights off at night out of simple energy-saving habits and started leaving them on deliberately, every single one we could manage, just for the small comfort of not being surrounded by total darkness. We stopped splitting up around the house the way families naturally do. One person in the kitchen, another upstairs, someone else in a bedroom, and instead found ourselves gravitating toward each other constantly, rarely more than a room apart, as if staying close together somehow made us less of a target. Looking back, I think that instinct was probably right, even if none of us could have explained exactly why at the time. The recordings themselves, the ones that first caught those unexplained voices and that guitar being played by no one, still exist somewhere, saved on an old device I've never quite worked up the courage to fully go back through again. I've listened to small pieces of them since, enough to confirm to myself that I hadn't imagined or exaggerated any of it in my memory, but never the whole thing straight through, never late at night, and never alone. Some part of me still isn't ready to sit with that sound again for longer than a few seconds at a time, even years later, even with the house long behind us and everything having gone quiet the way it has. My family doesn't talk about that period of our lives often, but when we do, usually during some quiet moment when the conversation drifts naturally toward it, everyone always comes back to the same two details above all the others. The sound of that guitar in an empty house, and the moment I described that vision to them the morning after it happened, the calm certainty in my voice as I told them it was over. That whatever it was had been told plainly it didn't belong, and that I somehow already knew, before we'd even confirmed it over the following days and weeks, that it wouldn't be coming back. My mom in particular has said more than once that she noticed a change in me the very morning after that vision, something settled and steady in the way I carried myself that hadn't been there in months, not since all of this had first started happening in that house. She said I walked around that morning with a kind of quiet confidence, none of the jumpiness or exhaustion that had become normal for all of us by that point, and that when I finally sat everyone down to tell them what I had seen, she believed me almost instantly. Not because the story itself was easy to accept on its own, but because of how completely calm and certain I seemed while telling it. Nothing at all like someone describing a nightmare or a trick of a frightened, exhausted mind. We ended up staying in that house for a good while longer after that. Long enough to be completely certain that whatever had left really had left for good and wasn't simply lying low before returning again the way it had after previous quiet stretches earlier on. Weeks turned into months, and the house remained exactly as peaceful as it had been in that first stretch of calm following the vision. No more knocking, no more music from an instrument none of us owned, no more black shapes standing silently in the hallway in the dead of night. Eventually, we did move away from that house, though by that point it had nothing to do with fear anymore, just an ordinary family decision unrelated to anything that had happened there before. Even now, in the new place we live, I still keep that same Bible close by at night, more out of habit and quiet gratitude than out of any lingering fear. A small, steady reminder of a night I still don't fully understand, but that I have never once doubted, not for a single moment, in all the years since it happened. Sometimes people ask me, when I tell this story, whether I'm ever afraid of something similar happening again in a new house, whether that fear ever really goes away completely once you've lived through something like that. Honestly, I don't think it ever fully disappears. Not entirely. There's still a part of me that notices when a house feels a little too quiet or a little too heavy in the air, some instinct left over from those months that probably won't ever fully switch off again. But underneath that lingering caution, there's also something steadier now, a quiet confidence I didn't have before that night. A sense that whatever else might come, I already know what real help looks like when it finally arrives. And I trust, without needing proof beyond what I already witnessed once myself, that it will come again if it's ever truly needed, standing at the bottom of whatever steps I happen to find myself facing next, arms open. Telling whatever doesn't belong there exactly the same thing it was told that night in my old house, calmly, firmly, and without any doubt at all that it would listen, the way it always seems to, once it truly hears who it is that's speaking. I've been hearing cats meowing outside my house lately, at odd hours, faint but unmistakable. The kind of sound that's hard to ignore once you actually notice it happening. The strange part is that we don't have a cat. We never have. Not now. Not at any point in the time we've lived in this house. No pet of any kind that could explain a sound like that drifting up from somewhere outside the walls late at night. At first, I tried to explain it away the same way anyone would, assuming it was probably just a neighborhood cat wandering through the yard, maybe one belonging to someone nearby, or a stray passing through looking for food or shelter the way strays sometimes do. That explanation felt reasonable enough at first, easy enough to accept without dwelling on it too much. But the meowing kept happening, again and again, always around the same general area outside the house, never quite consistent enough in timing to feel predictable, but frequent enough that it started to feel less like a coincidence and more like something worth paying closer attention to. I never actually saw a cat outside. Not once, despite hearing that sound so many separate times. I'd glance out windows when I heard it, sometimes even step outside briefly to check, and there was never anything there. No cat sitting in the yard, no shape moving through the bushes or slipping along the fence line the way a real animal would if it were actually out there making that sound. Just empty yard, quiet and undisturbed, every single time. no matter how quickly I managed to look. I started paying closer attention to when exactly the sound tended to happen, trying to find some kind of pattern that might make it feel a little less random and a little more explainable. It didn't seem tied to any particular time of night, sometimes coming just after sunset, other times much later, well past midnight, when the whole street outside had gone completely quiet and still. It also didn't seem tied to weather or season or anything else I could reasonably connect it to. It simply happened whenever it happened, unpredictable and untraceable, always from somewhere just outside the house, never once from anywhere close enough for me to actually pinpoint a source. A couple of times, I even walked the entire perimeter of the yard myself, flashlight in hand, specifically looking for any sign of a cat, paw prints in the dirt, fur caught on the fence, food or trash that might have been disturbed by an animal passing through. I never found anything at all, not once, no evidence that any actual living creature had been anywhere near that yard recently, despite how clearly and repeatedly I'd heard that meowing coming from somewhere just beyond the walls of the house. That unresolved mystery about the meowing was unsettling enough on its own, the kind of small, nagging strangeness that sits in the back of your mind without ever fully resolving itself. But it wasn't the only strange thing that happened in that house, and honestly, it wasn't even the most frightening. Looking back, I think the meowing had actually been going on for a while before the night everything else happened. Weeks at least, maybe longer, slowly becoming just another background oddity of living in that house rather than something that kept me up at night worrying about it directly. I'd almost gotten used to it in a strange way. The way you eventually get used to anything unexplained if it happens often enough without ever escalating into something worse. I never expected it to be connected to anything bigger. I certainly never expected the night that followed. One night I ended up falling asleep on the couch instead of making my way to my actual bedroom, mostly out of pure laziness more than anything else. Too comfortable and too tired to bother getting up and walking the extra distance down the hall. It happens sometimes, falling asleep somewhere you didn't plan to, drifting off in front of the television or halfway through scrolling on your phone, waking up disoriented later without quite remembering when exactly you lost consciousness. At some point during that night, I woke up suddenly, pulled out of sleep by the unmistakable sound of someone moving around the house. Footsteps, or something close enough to footsteps, moving through the space beyond the living room where I was lying, purposeful and steady in a way that immediately registered as a person walking rather than some ambient noise easily explained away as the house settling. Except everyone else in the house was asleep. I knew that immediately, without even needing to check, because I could sense the particular stillness of a fully sleeping house around me, that specific quality of silence broken only by the sound moving through it. Nobody else should have been up and walking around at that hour, and yet there it was, clear and undeniable, footsteps moving somewhere nearby while I lay frozen on that couch, wide awake now but too frightened to move or open my eyes. The sound didn't stay distant either. It got louder as it continued, drawing closer, moving with a slow, deliberate steadiness that felt far more unsettling than if it had been rushed or erratic. I lay there completely still, forcing my eyes shut as tightly as I could manage, my whole body rigid with fear, trying desperately to convince myself that if I simply didn't look, if I simply stayed motionless and pretended to be asleep, whatever was moving through that house wouldn't notice me lying there, wouldn't have any reason to stop and pay closer attention to the person frozen on the living room couch. Every second that sound continued felt impossibly long, stretched out by fear into something that seemed to last far longer than it probably actually did in reality. My mind raced through every possible explanation, and none of them made any sense given what I already knew for certain, that everyone else in the house was accounted for, asleep in their own rooms, nowhere near the space that sound was moving through. There was no one it could have been. No one, at least, that made any logical sense. I tried, in those long, stretched-out seconds, to catalog every detail I could pick up without actually opening my eyes, listening as carefully as I possibly could for anything that might help me understand what exactly was moving through the house. The footsteps didn't sound rushed or frantic. Nothing like someone sneaking around trying not to be heard. If anything, they sounded almost unbothered, unhurried, the pace of someone who had every right to be walking through that house at that hour, someone completely unconcerned about being noticed or overheard. That detail somehow made it worse rather than better, because it meant whatever was moving through my house that night wasn't behaving like an intruder trying to stay hidden. It was behaving like it belonged there. I also noticed, somewhere in the middle of all that fear, that the temperature in the living room seemed to drop, just slightly, just enough to register through the layer of panic gripping me at the time. I couldn't tell if that was real or simply my body's own physical reaction to terror. Adrenaline and fear doing strange things to how warm or cold a room feels when you're lying rigid and unmoving, too scared to even shift position. But the memory of that sudden chill has stuck with me just as clearly as the sound of the footsteps themselves. Another small, unexplained detail layered on top of everything else that night. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. Whatever had been moving through the house, drawing closer and closer with each passing second, simply disappeared, the sound cutting off completely, leaving the room in absolute silence again. I lay there afterward, heart still pounding, refusing to open my eyes even with the sound gone, too afraid that whatever had been there might still be nearby, watching, waiting to see if I'd finally look. I don't know exactly how long I lay there after the silence returned, eyes still shut, body still rigid, straining to hear even the smallest sound that might tell me whether it was truly safe to relax again. Every small, ordinary noise the house naturally made, the hum of the refrigerator somewhere down the hall, the faint tick of a clock, the distant sound of a car passing outside, seemed unbearably loud in that stretch of time, each one making my whole body tense all over again before I could convince myself it was nothing more than the house behaving normally. I kept waiting for the footsteps to start up again, half certain they would, half hoping desperately that they wouldn't. Caught in that, exhausting, suspended state of waiting for something you're terrified might actually happen. I never did open my eyes that night, not for a long while afterward at least. Instead, I forced myself back into sleep somehow, pushing through the fear and the racing thoughts until exhaustion eventually won out and pulled me back under, away from that couch and that dark, silent house and whatever had just moved through it only moments before. Looking back on it now, I still don't have any real explanation for what happened that night, or for the meowing that continues to happen outside a house that has never once had a cat living in it. Both things exist in my memory as separate, unresolved pieces of the same larger unease that settled over this house. Small, strange occurrences that never fully explain themselves, no matter how many times I turn them over, trying to find some rational answer that actually fits. The next morning, once daylight had fully returned and the house felt ordinary again, I actually got up and checked every single room myself, quietly, before anyone else in the family had woken up. I checked the front door and the back door, both still locked exactly the way they'd been left the night before, no sign at all of anyone having come in or gone out. I checked the windows too, one by one, looking for any indication that someone might have slipped in or out that way instead, and found nothing out of place there either. every latch still secure, every pane of glass undisturbed. Whatever had made those footsteps, it hadn't come from outside, and it hadn't left through any door or window either, at least not through any that I could find evidence of. I've mentioned the meowing to a few people since then, casually, mostly just to see if anyone else had a simple explanation I hadn't thought of yet. Most people just shrug it off, suggesting it's probably a neighbor's cat, or some stray that's found its way into our yard periodically without ever actually being seen. I want to believe that too, honestly, because it's a far more comfortable explanation than the alternative, that whatever is making that sound isn't an actual cat at all, and has no real business being anywhere near this house in the first place. The footsteps that night are harder to explain away with any comfortable, mundane answer. I've asked everyone in the house directly whether any of them were up and moving around that particular night, and every single person has confirmed the same thing, that they were sound asleep the entire time, with no memory of getting up or walking anywhere near the living room where I was lying on that couch. Nobody has ever offered any explanation that actually accounts for what I heard. Footsteps moving steadily closer through a house where every single other person was accounted for and asleep in their own bed. I still sleep on that same couch sometimes, when I'm too tired or too lazy to make it back to my room, though I'll admit that now, every time I do, some small part of me stays a little more alert than it used to, listening carefully to the quiet of the house around me, half expecting, half dreading the possibility of hearing those same footsteps again, moving slowly and deliberately toward me through the dark, while everyone else in the house remains fast asleep, completely unaware. The meowing still happens too, on and off, unpredictable in its timing, but consistent enough over time that I've genuinely stopped being surprised by it anymore, even though I've never once found any actual cat responsible for it. I've started to wonder whether the two things, the meowing outside and whatever moved through the house that night, might be connected somehow. Two different expressions of the same presence that's apparently decided to share this house with us, whatever it actually is. I don't have any real way of confirming that theory. No evidence beyond the simple fact that both things remain equally unexplained no matter how much time passes or how many rational explanations I try applying to them. I've talked to a couple of friends about all of this since it started, carefully, without going into every single detail at once, mostly just testing the waters to see how they'd react, before deciding how much more to share. Most of them offered the usual practical suggestions, telling me to check for gaps under doors that might explain drafts sounding like footsteps, or reminding me that houses settle and creak more than people realize, especially older ones, and that our minds are naturally good at turning ordinary sounds into something far more frightening once fear and exhaustion get involved. I've considered all of that seriously, turning each explanation over in my head more than once, trying to see if any of it genuinely accounts for everything I experienced that night. None of it quite does, not fully, not when I really think back on the specific details, the steady, unhurried pace of those footsteps, the way the sound grew louder in a straight, deliberate line toward where I was lying, and the abrupt, total silence that followed the instant it stopped. One friend, after hearing the whole story, admitted that her own childhood home had something similar happen more than once. Sounds of movement late at night, with everyone accounted for and asleep. And she told me that in her family's case. They'd eventually just learned to live alongside it, accepting it as simply another part of living in that particular house, rather than something worth constantly fighting or fearing. I think about that conversation a lot now, wondering if that's ultimately where I'll end up too, learning to coexist quietly with whatever this is, rather than ever fully understanding or resolving it. The living room where all of this happened wasn't a particularly large space, just an ordinary room with a couch, a television, A coffee table cluttered with the usual small things a family accumulates over time. Nothing about it that would normally strike anyone as unsettling in the daylight. But at night, with the lights off and everyone else asleep, that same room took on a completely different feeling. The shadows in the corners stretching out just a little further than they should. The doorway leading toward the rest of the house sitting there dark and open. A clear path for anything that might decide to come through it. I'd never really thought twice about sleeping out there before that night. Afterward, I noticed every single detail of that room differently. More aware of the shadows, more aware of exactly how far sound could travel from the hallway into that open space. I tried to think back rationally in the days after, wondering whether it might have simply been a dream. Some vivid, unusually detailed nightmare that felt real in the moment, but wasn't actually happening at all. I've had plenty of dreams before that felt convincing while they were happening, only to fall apart under closer examination once I was fully awake and thinking clearly again. But this didn't feel like that, not even slightly. I remember the transition too clearly, the moment of actually waking up, genuinely startled out of sleep by that first sound, followed by the slow, mounting fear as it grew louder and closer. Dreams don't usually carry that same specific, escalating quality, that sense of something building steadily worse in real time, rather than simply existing all at once the way dream logic usually works. For now, life in this house continues on mostly as normal, ordinary days, filled with ordinary routines. Broken up occasionally by that same strange meowing outside a window. Or, less often now, but never quite disappearing from memory, that lingering fear of hearing footsteps again on some quiet night, when everyone else is asleep, and I'm the only one left awake to hear them. I've thought more than once about moving, about whether starting fresh somewhere else might finally put an end to all of this. But so far, nothing has ever felt urgent or dangerous enough to actually push us toward that decision. It's more that this house now carries a quiet undercurrent of unease running beneath everything ordinary about it. Something none of us talk about often, but something all of us, I think, are at least a little aware of whenever the house goes still and quiet late at night. Every so often, usually late in the evening when the rest of the family has already gone to bed, I catch myself sitting in that same living room, glancing toward the hallway, listening a little more carefully than I probably need to, waiting to see if tonight might be the night it happens again. Most nights, nothing does. The house stays quiet. The meowing stays outside where it belongs, if it belongs anywhere at all, and I eventually make my way to bed without incident, same as always. But every so often, I still catch myself pausing there in the stillness, a beat too long, half expecting to hear that same steady, unhurried sound of footsteps moving toward me once more, out of a silence that never quite feels entirely empty anymore.